Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe, as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. The officers moved quickly, sweeping the house with flashlights and calling out Anne's name. Their voices echoed down the halls, blending with the haunting melody that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my mind. My wife, pale and trembling, clung to Emily, who stared blankly at the commotion. Unable to comprehend what was happening, I couldn't stop pacing, the gnawing fear in my gut making it impossible to stay still. Every room they checked and found empty felt like another nail being driven into my chest. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, trying to steady myself. One of the officers, a tall man with a heavy brow, came over. "We've searched the house thoroughly," he said, his voice steady but strained. "There's no sign of forced entry. No footprints outside the window. No indication she left on her own. But she's gone," I said, my voice cracking. "She wouldn't just disappear." I heard the whistling. There was someone outside her window. I know there was. The officer glanced at the others, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, but he didn't outright dismiss me. "We'll widen the search. I'll have units comb the woods." "But, sir," his tone softened, "it's important to stay calm. Children sometimes wander off. Maybe she's hiding." "We'll find her," I nodded numbly, though deep down I knew this was different. The eerie whistling still rang in my ears, a ghostly tune that seemed to grow louder every time I tried to block it out. As the night wore on, more officers arrived, along with search dogs and flashlights cutting through the shadows outside. My wife stayed glued to Emily, trying to keep her calm, though I could see the fear etched in her face. She hadn't said much since the police had arrived, but the haunted look in her eyes said everything. She knew something was horribly wrong, just like I did. Hours passed. The search stretched into the early morning, and still there was no sign of Anne. Every minute that ticked by felt like a lifetime, and I felt the walls closing in on me. The house, once a beautiful refuge for our family, now felt suffocating, like it was closing its grip around us. Finally, the lead officer returned, his face grim. "We've searched the entire perimeter. There's no trace of her." The weight of his words hit me like a truck. I collapsed into a chair, my mind spinning. How could she have just vanished? There were no answers, only more questions. And the whistling, it still hadn't stopped. Every time I tried to focus, it was there, faint and distant, like a constant reminder of what I'd lost. As the officers started to pack up, I heard a soft knock at the door. One of the officers answered it, and a woman stepped in, her face shadowed by the dim light. She was older, with deep lines etched into her face and sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through me. The officer gave her a nod. "This is Mrs. Agnes. She's lived in the area a long time. Thought she might be able to help." Agnes moved slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "I heard about the whistling," she said, her voice low and steady. "You heard it too, didn't you?" I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "Yes. It's been following me, and now my daughter, she's gone. Please, if you know anything, you have to help me." She sighed deeply, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in front of her. "The Whistler," she muttered. "I've heard stories about it my whole life, but I thought they were just old wives' tales, superstitions. No one's heard it in years." "The Whistler," I echoed, a chill creeping down my spine. "What is it?" Agnes glanced at the floor, as if weighing whether to tell me the truth. "They say it's a spirit, something old, older than this town. It comes to those who invite it in by whistling at night. The sound lowers it, draws it closer. Once it's heard, it's nearly impossible to stop. It feeds on the silence after the whistle, and when it comes for you, it takes something precious. My heart pounded in my chest. But I didn't mean to invite anything I didn't know. Inez's gaze softened, and she took a step closer. I know you didn't, but it doesn't matter. Once it's been invited, it doesn't leave until it's claimed what it wants. What can I do? I asked, desperation clawing at me. How do I get her back? She shook her head slowly. I don't know if you can, but you have to try. It wants more than just your daughter. It'll take everything from you if you let it. The whistler doesn't stop once it's started. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me, suffocating me. I looked around the room, at my wife, at Emily, and then back at Agnes. There has to be a way, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Agnes hesitated, then spoke again. There's one thing I've heard of, an old ritual, but it's dangerous, and there's no guarantee it'll work. I didn't care about the danger. I didn't care about anything except getting in back. Tell me what I have to do. Agnes took a deep breath and nodded slowly. All right, but once you start, there's no turning back. I shook my head, trying to fight the heavy pull of sleep. The whistling was doing something to us, lulling us into unconsciousness. I looked over at Emily, whose eyes were beginning to droop. I had to do something, anything to keep us awake. Stay with me, I whispered to my wife, gripping her hand. We can't let it take us. But her head was already falling forward, her body swaying as she struggled to stay upright. Panic clawed at my chest, and I slapped my face, trying to jolt myself awake. Emily, I shouted, my voice hoarse with desperation. Wake up. Her small figure stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open in confusion. I rushed over, shaking her gently. You have to stay awake, sweetheart. Do you hear me? Don't close your eyes. But even as I spoke, the whistling grew louder, more hypnotic, pulling us deeper into its grasp. The melody was relentless, winding its way through my mind like a serpent. I could feel my consciousness slipping, the edges of my vision darkening. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. The sound was so sharp, so out of place in the eerie silence, that it jolted me awake. My wife gasped, snapping back to attention as well. Without thinking, I ran to the door, my heart racing. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened it, half expecting to see something terrifying waiting on the other side. But instead, Agnes stood there, her face grim, a large bag slung over her shoulder. We don't have much time, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. It's started. If you want any chance of saving your daughter, we have to act now. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. What's happening? The whistling, Agnes said, setting her bag down on the motel room table and pulling out various items, candles, small jars filled with herbs, and what looked like a bundle of twigs tied together with red string. It's not just a sound, it's a lure. It's trying to pull you all into its world, just like it did with Anne. What can we do? My wife's voice was shaking, but her grip on my hand was strong. Please, tell us how to stop it. Agnes lit the candles, arranging them in a circle around the room. The flames flickered in the dim light, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. This ritual is old, older than anything I've seen before. It might not work, but it's your only shot. She placed the bundle of twigs in the center of the circle, then sprinkled herbs over it, chanting words under her breath that I didn't understand. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, a strange energy pulsing through the space. As Agnes worked, the whistling intensified, growing louder and more frantic. It was as if the entity knew what we were trying to do, and it didn't like it. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. "Stay inside the circle," Agnes instructed, her voice firm. "No matter what happens, do not leave this space." I nodded, pulling Emily and my wife into the circle with me. The whistling was unbearable now, drilling into my skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I clung to Emily, holding her close, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then went out entirely. The room plunged into darkness, save for the flickering candle flames. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the far corner of the room, I saw it, a shadow darker than the rest, slowly creeping toward us. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly far. My breath caught in my throat as the figure moved closer, its form barely visible in the dim light. The air grew colder, and I felt a deep, primal fear take hold of me. This was it, the whistler. Agnes continued her chanting, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. The shadow hovered just outside the circle, its presence heavy and menacing. Then, without warning, it lunged. The candles flared, their flames shooting up in a blinding burst of light. The shadow recoiled, retreating with a sound that was somewhere between a hiss and a growl. Inez's voice grew louder, more urgent, as she continued the ritual, her hands moving in swift, practiced motions for what felt like an eternity. The whistler and Agnes seemed locked in a silent battle, the entity testing the boundaries of the circle, pushing against the invisible barrier that kept it at bay. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Agnes spoke the final words of the ritual. The candles flickered one last time, then went out, plunging the room into darkness once more. I held my breath, waiting for the whistling to return, for the shadow to reappear. But the silence that followed was different. It was calm, peaceful. The oppressive weight that had hung over us lifted, and I could breathe again. Agnes slumped to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. "It's gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For now." My wife let out a sob of relief, pulling Emily close. I knelt beside Agnes, my heart still racing. "Is it over? Is Anne?" Agnes shook her head slowly. "It's not over. The whistler is weakened, but it's not defeated. If you want to get him back, you'll have to confront it. There's a place deep in the woods where the boundary between our world and theirs is thin. That's where you'll find her. But be warned, it won't let her go without a fight." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. The thought of facing that thing again was terrifying. But if there was even a chance of saving Anne, I knew I had to try. "When do we leave?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. Agnes looked up at me, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "At dawn." It began with Anne's disappearance, a night that felt too surreal to be true. My family was whole, safe, until that night. But the whistling, it lured her away, and the police found nothing. Now, here I sit, desperate, terrified, trying to understand how everything spiraled out of control. The motel was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where we could escape the presence that had invaded our home. But as the haunting melody filled the air, it became clear that no place was safe. The whistler was everywhere, stalking us with that eerie, bone-chilling tune. It stole Anne, and now it's after Emily. I couldn't stop it. I tried everything, staying awake, praying, reasoning with the irrational. But as soon as Emily opened that motel door and stepped into the void, I knew I'd lost. My little girl, gone. Like her sister before her, I returned to the house with Sarah, thinking perhaps there was something we missed, some clue to help us unravel this nightmare. But the house wasn't the same. The air felt thick, like we were wading through molasses. The walls seemed to close in around us, and that oppressive silence filled every corner. What had once been a warm and loving home had turned into a place of nightmares. I admitted to Sarah that it might be my fault, that somehow my whistling had beckoned the entity closer night after night, until it finally took what it wanted. I didn't want to believe it, but as soon as we pulled into the driveway, I felt it. The house was waiting for us, eager, like it knew we would return. We split up, Sarah heading upstairs, while I checked the backyard. I searched every corner, every shadow, but it was as if the girls had vanished into thin air. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. I was about to head back inside when I felt it. That strange sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. My skin prickled with unease, but I couldn't let fear control me. Not now. Inside, the house was too quiet. Every step I took felt like walking into a deeper abyss. My heart pounded in my chest, each thump echoing in the stillness. Then I heard my voice, calling out from the basement. I stumbled upstairs, searching for answers that weren't there. Every room felt like a tomb, filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. And then I heard it, the whistling. It started softly, a distant melody. It grew louder with each passing second. My heart raced, fear clawing at my chest as I realized the truth. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real, manifesting in the house, coming for me. I ran to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me, but the sound followed, growing louder, more insistent. I hid in the closet, trembling, knowing it was only a matter of time before it found me. The whistling was right outside the door now, seeping through the cracks, wrapping itself around me like a noose. I could feel its presence, cold and menacing, just beyond the thin barrier of wood. It was here for me now. I scribbled these final words in a desperate attempt to warn anyone who finds them. The whistler isn't just a sound. It's a force, an entity. And once it sets its sights on you, there's no escape. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't whistle past midnight, because if you do, it will come for you too. Her face was pale, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear, her breathing shallow. She looked at me, but it was as if she didn't truly see me, her gaze distant and unfocused. "Are you okay?" I asked more urgently now, kneeling beside her. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to snap herself out of whatever had gripped her. Finally, she whispered, "It was him. He was here." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Who was here? She didn't answer immediately, but after a few moments, she managed to speak. "The old man, the one who used to live here. He was standing right there." She pointed to the far corner of the room, her hand trembling. "He was watching me, smiling." I looked at the corner, half expecting to see anything, but it was empty. Just a shadowed space in the dim light of the room. My rational mind told me that it was impossible. The man had been dead for months. But the fear in her voice, the sheer terror on her face, was undeniable. "It's okay," I said softly, trying to calm her. "You're just shaken up. Let's get out of here for a moment. Some fresh air will help." She nodded weakly, still staring at the corner as I helped her up from the bed. Just as we turned to leave the room, a faint creak echoed through the house. We both froze. The sound had come from somewhere deeper in the house, possibly the hallway or even the kitchen. The dark-haired woman's grip tightened on my arm. "He's still here, ... I forced a calm I didn't feel and led her towards the front door, my heart racing. Every step felt heavier, as if the very air around us was thickening, pressing down, trapping us inside. As we reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The suitcases that had been there just moments ago were gone. I stopped, my pulse quickening. "Where are your things?" I asked, looking around frantically. She looked confused, glancing down the hallway. "They were right here, ... We packed them this morning, ... Double quotes. Panic started to bubble up inside me. The house felt different, now darker, oppressive, like something unseen was watching, waiting. "We need to leave now," I said, pulling her toward the door. Just as my hand touched the doorknob, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The house creaked again, louder this time, and from somewhere in the distance, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper of voice that sounded disturbingly familiar. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, using the dim light from the screen to illuminate the door. My fingers trembled as I turned the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it felt like it was locked, or worse, like something was holding it shut from the other side. "Come on," I muttered, frustration and fear overtaking me. I yanked at the door with all my strength, but it stayed firmly in place. The dark-haired woman began to sob softly beside me. "We're not getting out, are we?" she whispered. "Don't say that," I replied, trying to sound confident, though I wasn't sure anymore. I turned around to see if there was another way out, and that's when I noticed a faint glow coming from the far end of the hallway near the study. It was the same corner she had pointed to before, where she said the old man had been standing. "Stay here," I told her, my voice barely steady. She grabbed my arm. "Don't go," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "I'll just be a second," I reassured her, though I didn't believe my own words. Something was wrong, very wrong, and I needed to know what it was. Slowly, I made my way down the hallway, the glow becoming brighter with each step. When I reached the study, I stopped. The glow was coming from a small, old-fashioned radio sitting on the desk. It was on, though I hadn't noticed it before. The static-filled noise was soft but unnerving. I moved closer and reached for the dial, intending to turn it off, when the sound changed. The static faded, and a voice came through, a woman's voice. "I'm here." "I'm not disappearing." My hand froze above the radio, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the same phrase the blonde woman had mentioned earlier, the one they had heard the night before. As I stood there, transfixed, the air around me grew colder, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Slowly, I turned around, and there they were, the man and woman from my dream, standing in the doorway. Their faces were shadowed, but I could see their smiles, wide and unnatural. They were looking directly at me now, their eyes glinting in the dim light of the radio. "I'm here," the woman repeated, her voice a soft whisper. Though her lips didn't move, I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But there they were, as real as anything I had ever seen, standing in front of me, their hands slowly reaching out, as if to grab me. Without thinking, I turned and ran back down the hallway, past the dark-haired woman, who was now screaming, toward the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, and with a final, desperate pull, the door flew open, and we stumbled outside into the fresh air. The woman collapsed on the porch, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, panting, my heart racing as I looked back at the house. The lights were back on, and from the window I saw a shadow pass by, moving through the house as if nothing had happened. "Let's go," I said, helping the woman to her feet. We needed to get away from there, from whatever was inside that house. As we walked away, I glanced back one last time, and for a brief moment I thought I saw them again, the couple, standing in the window, watching us with those same unnatural smiles. But when I blinked, they were gone. As the car disappeared down the gravel road, A chill settled over me, the kind that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The Bentley, the woman in the driver's seat, it was all too familiar. I stood there, staring at the dust cloud left behind, my thoughts racing. Could it have been her, the old neighbor's wife? But that made no sense. She had died years ago. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange thoughts swirling in my mind. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe someone else in the area drove a similar car, though I had never seen another Bentley around here before. And yet, the unease wouldn't leave me. Turning back to the house, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave, to wash my hands of the whole bizarre situation. But something kept pulling me back. The dreams, the strange encounters, the house itself, it all felt connected, like there was a puzzle that hadn't yet been solved. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking back toward the house. The door was still ajar from when we'd rushed out. The quiet inside seemed heavier now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, and stood in the hallway, listening. Nothing. The oppressive silence was almost worse than the strange noises and whispers. My pulse quickened as I made my way through the house, stopping at each room, scanning for any sign of what might be behind all of this. The air felt thick with an unseen presence, the kind of heaviness that pressed down on your chest and made every breath a conscious effort. I found myself drawn to the study again, where the old radio still sat on the desk, its dial now dark. I hesitated before walking over to it, half expecting it to crackle to life again with that eerie voice, but nothing happened. I reached out and touched the cold surface of the radio, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were papers scattered across the desk, documents, letters, photographs. They looked old, yellowed with time, but one of the photos caught my eye. It was a picture of my old neighbor and his wife, taken sometime in the late 70s by the look of it. They were standing in front of the house, smiling at the camera. But there was something off about the photo. I squinted, bringing it closer to the dim light filtering in through the window. The couple looked younger, but the woman's face was oddly familiar, more so than it should have been. My heart skipped a beat as realization dawned on me. The woman in the photo, the one standing next to my neighbor, was the same woman I'd seen in the driver's seat of the Bentley, the same woman who had just driven away with the two renters. A cold wave of dread washed over me. This couldn't be possible. She was dead, and yet, I had seen her. I was sure of it. I dropped the photo back onto the desk, my hands shaking. This wasn't just some creepy coincidence or an overactive imagination. Something far stranger was happening here. Before I could gather my thoughts, I heard a soft creak from the hallway. My body tensed, and I slowly turned toward the sound. There, standing just inside the doorway, was the old man, the neighbor. He wasn't transparent or ghostly, but solid, real. He stood there, watching me with that same unsettling smile I'd seen in my dreams. My throat went dry, and I tried to speak, but no words came out. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and measured, almost calm. I backed up a step, my heart hammering in my chest. "You single quotes you're not real," I finally managed to stammer. He didn't move, didn't blink. "Real enough," he said softly, that smile never leaving his face. "You're in my house now." I glanced around, searching for an escape, but I was frozen in place. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The old man took a step forward, his eyes locked onto mine. I didn't want Anne, wanted to be left alone, but she she won't let go. "She's still here, waiting." "Who?" I croaked, already knowing the answer. "My wife," he said, his voice a whisper now. She never left. I took another step back, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled. As I struggled to regain my balance, the lights in the house flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The atmosphere in the room became suffocating. "She's always here," he continued, his voice growing distant, almost as if he were talking to himself now. "I hear her every night, laughing, watching. She won't let me go." His eyes shifted to something behind me, and before I could turn to see what he was looking at, I felt it a presence, cold and unnerving, standing just inches away. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned around. There she was, the old woman, the neighbor's wife. She stood right behind me, her face a mask of malice, her eyes gleaming with something dark and unfathomable. And she was smiling, that same twisted smile from the dream. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice sending a wave of terror through me. "I'm not disappearing." Without thinking, I bolted. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing through the house as I tore towards the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, but this time it gave way easily, and I stumbled outside into the fading light of the afternoon. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the meadow, my lungs burning and my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally looked back, the house stood there, still and quiet, the windows dark. But I could feel them watching, their presence lingering in the air, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. I knew, in that moment, that the house wasn't just haunted. It was alive in its own twisted way, and whatever had happened there, whatever strange bond the old man and his wife had shared, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house had claimed them, and now it was looking for someone new. "I bought this at a charity shop on Market Street," squealed my grandmother, excitement in her voice. "It looked like something you two would love." The box she held was rigid, its cardboard far too firm for what appeared to be its age. It was marked with black serif font that read, "Peter's Place." The cover depicted a small purple plastic figure striding forward, seemingly indifferent to the white plastic figures chasing after it. They all seemed to be heading towards a house in the distance, a childlike outline of a home, a triangle roof for windows and a door. The colors on the cover were faded, as if some details had been lost to time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had disappeared might have told us more about the game. Maybe it would have even warned us never to play it. Grandma placed the box on the coffee table with pride, and I shot a smug glance at my younger sister, Michaela, who stifled laughter. We'd never been fans of board games, but it was hard to say no to Grandma, especially these days. A few months ago, our parents had finally told us the truth. Grandma was showing early signs of vascular dementia. It explained the lapses in memory we'd noticed during our visits over the years. Knowing her time with us was limited made us more willing to indulge her, even if it meant spending an evening playing an old board game. Whether it was that or another night of watching Antiques Roadshow, we knew we'd do whatever it took to make her happy. "What are the rules, Emmett?" Grandma asked, looking at me. I lifted the lid of the box. It resisted slightly, like it didn't want to be open, but after a moment it came free with a loud scrape. "You need to hit the gem spaghetti lems," Michaela teased. I grinned and, without thinking, swung the lid playfully, accidentally thumping her on the nose. She recoiled, laughing, but Grandma's eyes suddenly glazed over. "Where did this game come from?" "It looks like fun," she said, her tone softer now, more uncertain. I sighed, feeling a weight in the air. "You got it for us, Grandma, from that shop on Market Street." "Oh," she murmured, clearing her throat as though trying to push past her confusion. Yes, that's right. Let's play, shall we? I smiled, trying to lighten the moment. First, I need to read the rules, and you better explain them, cheater, Michaela added, flashing a playful glare. Of course, I chuckled. I'll read them word for word. And I bet you'll still spend 20 minutes checking the rule book to make sure I didn't lie. That's right, Michaela said with a nod, and after that, one of you will have to read them again because I'll have forgotten by then. Grandma chimed in with a giggle. We all laughed, but there was a hint of sadness in the room. Grandma's, but still surfaced sometimes. But those moments were fewer and farther between. The diagnosis had changed everything. Every joke, every shared memory felt like a fragile thing, slipping through our fingers. We were laughing, but grief lingered just beneath the surface. Grief for the woman Grandma used to be, the sharp mind that was slowly fading. I cleared my throat to break the silence and began explaining the R. Teeter's Placide house is home. It safeguards everything that is precious to you, everything you hold dear. But now you are displaced, and you must return to that house. And fortunately, you're not the only one with eyes on that sanctuary. Peter has seen that you are far from home, and he intends to take everything from you. You and your teammates must work together to reach the house. Each player controls a white figure, and after every turn, Teeter, the purple figure moves one square closer to the house. You win if all players reach the house before Peter. You lose if it becomes Peter's place. Peter cannot be stopped. He moves steadily, without pause, and no obstacle can slow him down. You, however, may grow weary. The journey may take everything from you. After each move, you will draw an item card and a choice card, corresponding to the color of the square you land on, either red or green. Event squares trigger an event card. If a player reaches the house, they no longer need to draw cards. Once everyone crosses the finish line, a final event card will determine your victory or defeat. Peter is ambitious, acquisitive, and self-serving. To him, the house is not a home, it is food, and he will stop at nothing to take it from you. One day, Peter will have his place. When all players are ready, the game begins. Grandma sighed. That was a lot to take in. I smiled, trying to reassure her. It's simpler than it sounds. It's a strategy game, but nothing too complex. Think of it like chess. You're good at chess, and we're all working together, Michaela added. So we'll help you out. That's right, I nodded. Let's give it a try. I started unfolding the board, revealing a maze of paths that all led to a simple, featureless house at the center. Some routes passed through a dense forest, others through an abandoned town. There were dozens of different ways to reach the house, but no clear indication of which was safest. The quickest path seemed to hug the border between the forest and the town, but something about the green squares on that route made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that Peter's place was more than just a game. It was almost as if the board itself wanted me to linger, to stare too long at the paths that would soon lead us to trouble. What are you holding, Emmett? Grandma asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. I realized I'd been absent-mindedly holding an old cotton bag from the box. I opened it and pulled out 4 small figurines, 3 white and 1 purple. What are the odds? Michaela said with a laugh. It's like the game was made for us. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of playing this game unnerved me. Still, I wasn't about to back out. Not tonight. Not when it mattered to Grandma. We placed the white pieces on the starting square, and I carefully set the purple figure on its own track. Teeter's route was shorter, with fewer obstacles. He would move slowly, but surely toward the house, and we would have to outrun him. We're in a hurry, aren't we? Grandma chuckled, picking up one of the white figures. It's been a long time since I could run like this, and look at Peter. Michaela added, pointing to the purple piece. "He's hardly even trying." "Are we ready?" I asked, hesitating for a moment. "Or should we watch TV instead?" "No," Grandma said firmly. "Let's play," I nodded, knowing that these moments with her were fleeting. Soon, we might not be able to play games at all. "Who goes first?" I asked, holding up the first piece. Grandma smiled. "I'll go. Just move the piece for me. It's hard for me to reach from here." I placed the figure on the board and glanced toward the back door, which had suddenly clicked open. A chill ran through me. The back door had been locked. The moment I read those words, a cold sweat formed on my brow, and my stomach lurched. My mind raced as I stared at the crudely etched message on the underside of the game box. "Can't kill it. Don't play it." Who had written that? And more importantly, what did it mean? I was paralyzed for a moment, feeling as though the air had thickened around me, pressing in on my chest. The eerie implications of the words gnawed at me like a dark whisper on the edge of my thoughts. My hands trembled as I flipped the box back over and tried to convince myself it was some prank. Maybe Michaela or one of her friends had scribbled it as a joke, but my gut told me otherwise. Everything about this game felt wrong and natural. It wasn't just the strange coincidences, the odd feelings, or the creeping unease that had built with every turn. There was something else, something beyond the game, lurking just out of sight. I was drawn back to the living room, to the game board itself. Teeter's purple figurine stood in its new position, unmoved since Michaela had advanced it. But it now seemed more menacing. The tiny plastic piece felt like a symbol of something far more sinister, something waiting for us to make our next move. I didn't want to keep playing, but what could I say? Michaela and Grandma would return any moment, expecting me to have the game ready. I wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to calm myself, and checked my phone for the nearest takeaway options. Maybe a break for dinner would clear my head. Just as I was about to dial, I heard it. A soft, raspy sound. Breathing. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there, coming from the far corner of the room, the same empty corner where I'd thought I'd heard something earlier. My heart thudded in my chest as I slowly turned my head, forcing myself to confront the source of the noise. Nothing. The corner was empty, just like before, but the noise, it was still there, shallow, steady breaths, as though something or someone was standing just out of sight. I swallowed hard and forced a laugh, trying to rationalize it. "It's the wind," I whispered to myself. "Just the wind." Then, as if on cue, the back door creaked open again. I leapt to my feet, nearly tripping over the game board, and sprinted to the hallway. The door was ajar, its latch still broken, and beyond it, that same dark and shapeless figure loomed at the edge of the forest. It hadn't moved since I first spotted it, but now it felt closer, more defined. My mouth went dry as I watched it, my muscles frozen in place. It watched me back. I knew it was watching me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. Before I could think, I slammed the door shut, my chest heaving with panicked breaths. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave the house, to drag Grandma and Michaela out with me. But I knew I couldn't. Whatever that thing was, it was waiting. And leaving the house wasn't going to change that. Footsteps echoed down the hall as Michaela helped Grandma back towards the living room. I had to pull myself together, act normal, and get through dinner without raising any alarms. "You all right, Emmett?" Michaela asked as she entered the room. She glanced at me curiously, noticing my pale face and shaky hands. I forced a smile, stuffing my phone into my pocket. "Yeah, just deciding on dinner. How does pizza sound?" "Sounds perfect," Michaela replied, her usual energy masking any concern. "We're starving." Grandma settled into her chair, smiling faintly, but looking more exhausted than before. "Pizza sounds lovely, dear. But are we continuing the game after?" I hesitated. Every part of me wanted to say no, to end this strange, creeping nightmare once and for all. But something stopped me, like the pull of an invisible thread that tied me to the board. "Yeah, sure," I said quietly, not even convincing myself. "We can finish." I ordered the pizza, trying to distract myself from the mounting fear. As we waited for the food, Grandma and Michaela chatted lightly about nothing in particular, their voices comforting in the growing darkness. But my eyes kept wandering back to the game, to the sinister little piece that was Peter. Each second felt heavier than the last, like the air was thickening with an unseen force, pressing down on all of us. I couldn't help but glance at the back door again, half expecting it to creak open. The door stayed closed, but I could still feel that presence, waiting just beyond the thin walls of the house. Finally, the pizza arrived, and we took a break from the game. But as we ate, I noticed how the conversation kept circling back to the board, like it had a gravitational pull of its own. Despite everything, we all seemed eager to continue playing, like the game was drawing us in, tempting us to finish what we'd started. By the time we sat back down, I had resolved to end it quickly, get through the turns, reach the end of the board, and never look at it again. But as I moved my piece forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, biding its time. Grandma took her next turn, her hands trembling slightly as she moved her piece back into the forest. She picked up another green card, her eyes narrowing as she read it. "The trees whisper your name," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You hear footsteps, but when you turn, no one is there. Do you press forward, moving to spaces, or retreat, moving back one space and skipping your next turn?" "I think I'll go back," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't want to keep going." I moved her piece back, relieved that she was playing it safe. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted again. Michaela's light-hearted banter had disappeared, replaced by a tense silence. My turn was next. I moved my piece cautiously forward, landing on a red square. I picked up an item card, bracing myself. "A flashlight," I read aloud, trying to sound casual. "Good, you'll need it," Michaela said, her voice suddenly low, almost distant. I glanced at her, surprised by her tone, but she was focused on the board. By the time I reached Grandma's house, my hands were still trembling, my heart still racing. The pizza sat cold on the passenger seat, forgotten, as my mind replayed the events in that cursed supermarket. The laughter, the twisted face, the impossible smile. It was as if reality had been peeled back, revealing something monstrous beneath. The lights in the house were dim, and the sight of that cozy glow should have been comforting. But all I could think about was the message scratched into the box. "Can't kill it. Don't play it." I parked the car and sat there for a moment, my fingers gripping the wheel as I stared into the shadows beyond the driveway. The night was unsettlingly quiet, and the faintest rustle of leaves sent shivers down my spine. There was something out there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence lurking just beyond the trees, watching me, waiting. Reluctantly, I stepped out of the car, pizzas in hand, and hurried to the front door. My fingers fumbled with the keys, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing closer. The air seemed thicker, like it was pressing in on me. When I finally opened the door, I bolted inside, slamming it shut behind me. "Emmett, you're back," Michaela called from the living room, her voice sounding far too normal for the night I'd just endured. I forced a smile as I walked in, setting the pizzas down on the coffee table. Grandma was seated in her chair, her eyes half closed, looking peaceful. but I couldn't help but wonder if that was just a facade. The game board still lay between them, the figures on the board frozen in place, as if waiting for something or someone. "Your turn," Michaela said with a teasing smile. Pointing at my piece, I stared at the board, at the tiny figurines, and the unease that had settled deep within me flared up again. "I think we should stop playing." "What?" Michaela looked at me like I had lost my mind. "We barely even started." "No, seriously," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Something's wrong with this game," Michaela scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You're just scared because you got a creepy choice card. It's just a game, Emmett. You've been watching too many horror movies." I glanced at Grandma, but she didn't seem to notice the tension between us. She was lost in her own world, staring at the board with a peculiar focus. "I'm not joking," I insisted, lowering my voice. Something's wrong with this game. I saw things at the store, Michaela, things that shouldn't have been there. "What are you talking about?" she asked, the playful smile slipping from her face as she noticed the fear in my voice. "What did you see? A woman?" "If you can call her that," I said, my throat tight as I remembered her eyeless face, the grotesque smile. "She wasn't human. She chased me through the store. And before that, the entire town it was empty. Completely deserted." Michaela's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "Are you serious?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't think this game is just a game, Michaela. There's something alive about it. Something dangerous." She hesitated, glancing down the board. "But how? It's just cardboard and plastic." "That's what I thought too," I reply. "But whatever's happening, it's real. And it started when we opened this box." Michaela stared at the board, her fingers hovering over her piece as if she were considering moving it anyway. Then she looked up at me, her face pale. "What do? We stop playing," I said firmly. "We get rid of it, burn it if we have to." Grandma suddenly stirred in her chair, her voice soft but clear. "You can't get rid of it." Both Michaela and I turned to look at her. Grandma's eyes were focused on the board, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You can't kill it," she whispered, her voice a shadow of its usual warmth. "Once you start playing, it never leaves. It stays with you." It follows. A cold chill ran down my spine. The words etched into the box flashed in my mind again. "Can't kill it." "Grandma," Michaela said gently, kneeling beside her. "What are you talking about?" Grandma's eyes were glazed over, distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the room. "It's been watching for years, waiting for someone to play. Now that you've started, it won't stop." I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "But we can stop, right? We can stop playing and it'll go away." Grandma slowly shook her head. "No, it won't go away. It'll come for you, Emmett. It always does." I felt the room close in around me, the weight of her words sinking deep into my chest. Michaela stood up, her face pale and drawn, as if she were realizing the gravity of the situation. "So what do we do?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever had been unleashed by that game was far beyond our understanding, and it wasn't going to stop. Suddenly, the room seemed darker. The shadows stretched longer, the corners of the room dimming, as if the light itself were retreating. The air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken presence. And then, from the far end of the hallway, I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. "Learn what, exactly?" Grandma, or rather, the younger version of her, asked, trembling. Her voice was small, barely audible over the grinding of the metal beast. The man grabbed her by the arm, pulling her closer to the machine. "You'll learn to obey," he snarled, his face twisted with anger. This is your family's legacy, Annabelle. You can't run from it." I watched, helpless, as my grandmother was dragged toward the monstrous machine. Its gears groaned and whirred, the blades inside slicing through the oats as if they were nothing more than soft butter. A thick, acrid smell hung in the air-burning oats, mixed with something I couldn't quite place, blood. It felt like the machine was alive, feeding on more than just grain. Annabelle, my grandma, struggled in the man's grip. Tears streamed down her young face, her voice cracking with fear. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want it. You don't have a choice." The man's grip tightened as he forced her closer to the grinding metal. "This land, this farm, it's cursed because of your family. You think you can just abandon it? You think you can escape?" I tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but my body was frozen, glued to the spot as I watched the horror unfold. It was like being trapped in a nightmare. The world around me spun in slow motion, every sound distorted, every movement a haze. Then I saw the box, the very same game box that had sat innocuously in Grandma's house, taunting us all night. It rested on a nearby conveyor belt, inching ever closer to the monstrous machine. As it moved, the lights flickered again, casting the room in a harsh, sickly glow. Something about the box seemed alive, pulsating with an unseen energy, as though it were feeding on the fear and chaos. Suddenly, the man released Annabelle and turned toward the box. "The source," he muttered, his voice a deep growl. "The damn game. It must be destroyed." He reached for it, but before he could lay a hand on the cursed object, a loud snap echoed through the factory. One of the machine's gears had jammed, sending sparks flying across the room. Annabelle seized the opportunity, scrambling away from the man and towards a rusted door at the far end of the factory. "Run, Grandma," I screamed, finally able to move my limbs. But my voice echoed hollowly, unheard, as if I were speaking from another dimension. The man snarled again in rage. His body twisted unnaturally as he lunged after her, but just as he reached her, the machine let out a deafening roar. The conveyor belt carrying the box jerked violently, pulling the man into the spinning blades. I winced, turning away as a sickening crunch filled the room. The man's screams were cut short, swallowed by the metal beast. The factory fell silent. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could fully process it, the world around me shifted again. The lights flickered, and suddenly I was no longer in the factory. I was back in Grandma's living room, the game board still spread out before us. MIKYLA, and Grandma sat in their chairs, just as they had been before. Both were staring at me with wide and blinking eyes. "Emmett," Michaela whispered, her voice trembling. "Where did you go? What happened?" "I don't know," I stammered, glancing down at the board. The pieces were still in place, just as we had left them. But something was different. The game wasn't over. "We finished," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We crossed the line. It should be over." But as I looked closer, I saw the final event card I had drawn was still lying face up on the table. The words seemed to pulse, much like the box had in the factory. "It is time to put your decisions to the test." Michaela gasped, pointing to the board. "Emmett, look, the game pieces, the tiny representations of us were moving. On their own, slowly, inexorably, they began to circle the house, the final destination, over and over again, like we were caught in some endless loop. "We need to destroy it," Michaela whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. "The game, it's not finished with us." I nodded, but before I could respond, the room around us began to darken again. The shadows crept in from every corner, swallowing the light, until all that remained was the glowing game board. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard it, the laughter, That terrible, inhuman laugh. It was her. The woman from the supermarket, and she was coming for us. The silence that followed was deafening. My sister stood frozen, the broadsword still raised in her trembling hands, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The monstrous entities had been reduced to nothing but ash, dissolving into the earth like a nightmare slipping through the cracks of reality. I rushed over to Michaela, my legs barely carrying me after the surreal terror we had just endured. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief as the sword clattered to the ground. Emmett. What did I just do? She whispered, staring down at the ash, her voice raw with fear and confusion. I didn't have the answer. Everything felt wrong, twisted, as if we had stepped into a world where the rules of reality had shattered like a broken mirror. The broadsword, the monsters, the factory. It all felt so impossibly real and yet absurdly detached from anything logical. I wanted to tell her it was all a dream, but we both knew it wasn't. We need to go, I urged, pulling her towards the direction of Grandma's house. Now we need to find Grandma and get out of here, but deep down I knew Grandma was gone. The weight of that knowledge sank into my chest as we stumbled back through the field. The factory had vanished, the clearing now just a stretch of overgrown grass, but the dark presence of something far worse lingered in the air. The game, the cursed game that had brought us here. It wasn't finished with us yet. We crossed the threshold into the house, the door creaking as it swung shut behind us. Inside, the oppressive silence of the living room greeted us. The game board still sat there, unmoved, as if mocking us. I could feel the tension in Michaela, her body taut with apprehension, and I could sense the unspoken question hanging in the air. What now? I don't want to touch that game again, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded in agreement, but something told me it wouldn't be that simple. The game wasn't just a board, it was alive, feeding off our fear, our decisions, our very existence. It had pulled us into its nightmarish web, and I doubted it would let us go without a fight. Suddenly, the board shifted. Without anyone touching it, the pieces began to move slowly at first, then faster, spinning around the house in an unnatural pattern. A faint humming sound filled the room, growing louder, more menacing. The lights flickered, and the air thickened with the same suffocating dread I had felt before. Then the final event card flipped over, revealing its ominous message. You have played the game. Now the game plays you. A chill ran down my spine. We have to end this, I muttered, stepping closer to the board. But how? Destroying it might only release whatever malevolent force was tied to it. Playing any further might push us deeper into the abyss. Michaela, wide-eye, backed away from the table. What does it mean, Emmett? What does it want? I don't know, I replied, panic bubbling up in my chest. But we have to finish this. I reached out towards the board, but the moment my fingers brushed against the edge, a searing pain shot through my hand. I recoiled, clutching my wrist as an invisible force knocked me back. The game wasn't going to let us off that easily. The humming grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the entire house was vibrating with the sound. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, trapping us within the game's malicious grip. In that moment, I knew what we had to do. It's us, I whispered, realization dawning. It's been us all along, the game. It's feeding off our choices, our decisions. We can't destroy it, Michaela. We have to outplay it. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice shaking. I think the game needs us to make a final choice. We started this, and now we have to finish it together. Michaela looked at me, terror in her eyes, but she nodded. Okay, let's end it. We both move towards the game board. The pieces had stopped spinning. Resting in their final positions near the house, my heart pounded in my chest as we reached out together, placing our hands on the board. The humming stopped. A voice cold and distant, yet unmistakably familiar, whispered through the silence. Choose. I swallowed hard. The choices we had made in the game were now staring us in the face. The road we had taken, the weapons we had wielded, the monsters we had faced, all of it had led us here to this moment. We finished the game, I said, my voice steady despite the terror gnawing at my insides. No more running. No more hiding. Michaela's hand tightened on the board. Together, the room seemed to hold its breath as we made our final decision. The pieces on the board began to move again, but this time they didn't stop at the house. They moved beyond it, into the unknown. The board shifted and twisted, folding in on itself, the lines of the game blurring as reality and nightmare fused together. Then, with a sudden, deafening crash, the game shattered. The pieces flew across the room, scattering like ashes. The board crumbled into dust, dissolving into the air, leaving nothing but an eerie stillness in its wake. The house was silent once more. Michaela and I stood there, staring at the empty table where the game had been. The nightmare was over, but the weight of everything we had experienced lingered. I knew we would never be the same. Is it really over? Michaela whispered, her voice fragile, as if she didn't quite believe it. I didn't have an answer, but as I pulled her into a tight hug, I prayed that it was, because if it wasn't, I wasn't sure we'd survive the next round. The days that followed were a blur of nightmares, guilt, and a creeping dread that never left me. Michaela and I tried to settle back into some version of normalcy. But how do you return to normal when you've been pulled into something so far beyond your understanding? We never talked about that night again. Not really, not in detail. We didn't talk about the shadows in the forest, or the figure of Peter, who had appeared and disappeared like some grim omen. We didn't talk about Gren, at least, not the version of her we had seen during the game, the one who had lived through unspeakable horrors at the hands of her husband. Instead, we filled our conversations with small talk, school, work, anything mundane to distract ourselves from the lingering presence of the game that still loomed in the back of my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that factory, saw Grandma's face as she aged in front of me, and saw myself running away when she needed me most. It ate away at me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. Weeks turned into months, and for a time, life moved on. I was back in my dorm at college, trying to focus on classes, but the box was always there, sitting in the corner of my room, untouched but undeniably present. I had shoved it into the back of my closet, buried beneath layers of old clothes and forgotten things. But I knew it was there. Some nights I swore I could hear the faint sound of dice rolling or the whisper of the pieces shifting on their own. It was subtle, easy to write off as imagination, but I knew better. I knew the game was still waiting for something, for someone. Michaela and I had made an unspoken pact not to speak of it, but I could sense that she felt the same way. We were both haunted in our own ways by the remnants of that night. I wondered if she could feel the itch in the back of her mind, the quiet whisper that the game wasn't finished with us. It was a cold, rainy evening when I found myself staring at the closet. I had a paper due, but my mind kept wandering back to the box. I hadn't touched it since that night, but now I found myself drawn to it. Maybe it was some twisted form of curiosity, or maybe it was the guilt gnawing at me like a festering wound. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of the closet, my hand hesitating on the door handle. A deep sense of foreboding settled over me. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to see it. Had to know if it was still the same. I pulled the door open slowly, and there it was. The box sat in the same spot where I'd left it, as unassuming as ever, but even just looking at it, I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. You have played the game. Now the game plays you. The words from that final Yvette card echoed in my mind. I knelt down and gingerly pulled the box from its hiding place. It felt heavier in my hands than I remembered. As I set it down on my desk, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This was a mistake. I knew it was a mistake, but I couldn't stop. The lid was worn, just as it had been before, with its strange symbols and ominous design. I hesitated, my fingers grazing the edge of the lid. When I heard a knock on my door, I jumped, the sudden sound pulling me out of the trance-like state I had fallen into. My heart raced as I turned towards the door. Emmett. A familiar voice called softly, "Mikyla." I quickly shoved the box back into the closet and shut the door before rushing to let her in. She stood in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes darted nervously around, as if she expected something to jump out at her from the shadows. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep seeing it." I didn't have to ask what she meant. I knew. I was seeing it too. "I can't stop thinking about him," she continued, stepping inside. "About Peter. About how he looked at us. It's like I feel like he's still out there. Like he's waiting." I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic in my chest. "We've finished the game, Mikyla. It's over, is it?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with doubt. What if it never really ends? I didn't have an answer for her, because deep down I knew she was right. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing what to say. The rain pattered softly against the window, and for a brief moment it felt like we were back in Grandma's house, trapped in that nightmare all over again. Then, out of nowhere, Mikyla stood up. "We should get rid of it." I stared at her. "The game." She nodded, her jaw set with determination. "We've tried burning it, cutting it. Nothing worked, but we can't just leave it here. We can't keep living like this." She was right. We couldn't keep carrying the weight of that cursed thing. But the thought of getting rid of it filled me with dread. What if it found its way to someone else? What if it unleashed its horrors on another unsuspecting person? "We can't just dump it," I said, my voice trembling. "What if someone else finds it? We'll figure it out," Mikyla replied. "But we can't let it control us anymore. We can't keep living in fear." Her words gave me strength, and for the first time in weeks I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could find a way to end this once and for all. As we stood there, ready to face whatever came next, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That somewhere in the shadows, Peter was still watching, waiting, but no matter what, we would face him together. And this time, we wouldn't let the game win, because one way or another, we would find a way to end it or die trying. I'm not young, I'm not exactly old either, but definitely older than most of you reading this. I grew up in a time before smartphones, when the internet was just beginning, and there were no forums like this to share our weird or terrifying experiences. Looking back, I wish there had been something like that back then. Maybe I could have gotten some advice, or at least left a clearer record of what happened. My memories of that time are clouded by years of trying to forget, a mix of alcohol and bad decisions from my 20s covering up the trauma. I had almost buried it completely, but then, out of nowhere, it all came back. I guess my brain protected me for a long time, but now the memories are flooding to the surface, and with them comes the terror. But I'm jumping ahead. Let's go back to where it all started. It was 1996, and I was 14, living in a small California mountain town. My parents had decided to move away from the city, buying a house in the middle of nowhere. My dad was tired of city life and wanted peace, where our closest neighbor would be nearly a mile away. To him, it was paradise. To me and my sister Katie, it was the end of everything we knew. Katie, being older by 2 years, adjusted quickly. She was pretty, outgoing, and made friends at school almost immediately. I wasn't as lucky, awkward, quiet, and a bit of a loner. I struggled. It was an hour's bus ride to school, and I felt like an outsider the whole time. Kids picked on me, and I didn't fit in. My dad didn't care much about that. Instead, he saw it as an opportunity for me to toughen up and learn some practical skills. If you're not going to be out there with friends, you might as well learn how to take care of things around here, he said one morning. And just like that, my summer was gone. No more PlayStation, no more Resident Evil, just endless chores. I spent my summer cleaning gutters, mowing the lawn, repainting the garage, and most importantly for this story, helping him build the new woodshed. Nah, when I say I helped, what I really mean is that I did most of the work while he supervised. My dad always wanted me to be more hands-on, but I was the type of kid who preferred video games and drawing. Still, he pushed me through it, insisting that hard work would build character. We gotta get you some calluses, kiddo, he would say, clapping me on the back. Builds character. I'm not sure I built any character, but I definitely built the woodshed. The floor was made of old pallets, and we used huge, sharp aluminum sheets for the roof and walls. I can't tell you how many times I cut myself on those damn sheets. By the end, I looked like I'd been in a fight with a box of razor blades. Sometimes I wonder if all that blood I spilled on the grass is what summoned him, like I accidentally performed some kind of ritual without even knowing it. Step 1. Bleed all over your backyard while cursing about building a shed. Step 2. Wish you could do anything else but help your dad. Step 3. Summon an ancient evil that will haunt you for the rest of your life. I'm kidding, of course. It wasn't the blood, and it wasn't the shit either. Not really. The shed just happened to be where I first saw him. It was the night we finished building it. My dad was actually impressed with my work, which was rare. He even brought me a Coke with dinner, saying it would have been a beer if I were older. For once, I felt like I'd done something right. As much as I make my dad sound like a hard ass, the truth is he was a good man, just old-fashioned. He was tough, sure, but he was proud of me that night. And for a few brief hours, everything felt normal. But that night, that was when everything changed. It was the night I saw him, the first appearance of the shadow. Dr. Moss leaned back into his bed, his face a mixture of exhaustion and reverence. His hands trembled slightly as he continued. I had to know more. I was driven by curiosity, but also a creeping sense of dread. Something didn't feel right, even back then. Professor Willow was either a genius beyond my comprehension or a dangerous fool tampering with forces he didn't fully understand. I asked Kamer for more details, but he deflected, insisting that all would be revealed in time. Dr. Moss stopped, taking a deep breath, as if gathering strength to go on. His eyes, once bright with intellect, now seemed hollow. Kamer came to visit a few more times, always with more grandiose tales of Professor Willow's breakthroughs. But after a while the letters stopped. It was like he vanished off the face of the earth. No one in our circles knew what had become of him, and all my inquiries led to dead ends. I sat forward in my chair, hanging on every word, So ... what happened to Willow? And that thing in the crate this morning? What was it?" Dr. Moss looked straight at me, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. Willow's work was not with plants alone. He had taken genetic engineering to realms that should never have been crossed. What you saw in that crate was one of his creations, a mixture of human and other things. He believed he was accelerating evolution, pushing life to its extremes, but what he created was an abomination, and Kamer had become obsessed with it. I felt a shiver down my spine as the reality of the situation began to settle in. "But why did you get involved? Why bring it to the Institute?" "I never wanted it here," Dr. Moss replied, his voice strained. "Kamer sent it to me out of desperation. He must have realized too late that Willow had gone too far. That creature, what you saw, it wasn't meant to survive, but somehow it did. And when I saw that crate this morning, I knew it had to be destroyed." Silence fell between us as I processed his words. The room felt heavy, suffocating. The nurse's earlier warnings about not getting him to worked up now made sense. Dr. Moss looked like he was on the edge of collapse. But I still had one final question burning in my mind. "Dr. Moss, is Willow still out there?" He closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his face. "I don't know. But if he is, then God help us all." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating any further conversation. I left the hospital room, my mind racing with fear and questions. The world outside felt colder, more sinister, as if something terrible had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped. As I stepped into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The nurse tells me I can see him, but cautions me not to get him too worked up. After all, he is recovering from a heart attack. It's past midnight, and I haven't eaten a single thing all day except for 6 cups of coffee. Everything feels like a blur, my memories drifting between reality and dream. I know I must look disheveled, far from composed. The nurse hesitates before eventually taking me across the hall. There's an empty bed in the room, and then I see him, Dr. Moss, the man who once carried an air of regal authority, always calm and composed no matter what crisis hit the research institute. Even during staff picnics, when he traded his bow tie for an apron at the grill, he was a figure of dignity. But now, frail and pale, he looks like a soldier who's lost the war. Still, he smiles as he recognizes me, and for a brief moment, there's a hint of my old mentor in his greeting. Yet I know why I'm here. The morning's events loom over us like a dark cloud. I ask him about the crate that was delivered to the facility earlier in the day, the crate that contained a monstrous thing we barely destroyed. I ask how he knew what was inside it. His response takes a long time. "Did you destroy this specimen?" he asks, his voice tired and hoarse. "Yes, just like you asked." "Incinerated it." Dr. Moss lets out a long, heavy sigh. His eyes drift toward the window, searching for something in the glow of the street lamps that he'll never find. He begins to speak slowly, recounting a story from years ago. He tells me about a man named Nurse Kamer, whom he met at a symposium in Prague in the late 90s. They had become friends, exchanging long, detailed letters about their research. But the real story, he explains, began when Kamer met Professor Henry Willow. When Dr. Moss utters the name Professor Henry Willow, there's venom in his voice. He recounts how Kamer wrote about Willow with an almost religious fervor, describing him as a man who could eradicate hunger and manipulate life itself. Moss invited the two to visit his research facility. Curious yet skeptical of Willow's supposed breakthroughs, the nurse reappears, breaking the tension. Dr. Moss waves her away, and I can't help but notice the suspicion in her eyes as she leaves. Once the door clicks shut, Dr. Moss continues. He describes a dinner they had him, Kamer, and Willow. Willow barely spoke, constantly scribbling in a childish notebook covered in Pokemon characters. Moss doubted the man's brilliance until, at Kamer's urging, Willow gave a demonstration. With a pinch of strange yellow sand, Willow weighed a pot of basil sprout grass so fast that it choked the basil to death within seconds. Moss had been stunned, unable to explain what he saw, but it wasn't the rapid growth that disturbed him the most. It was what came after. Later that evening, back at the research facility, Willow took a handful of the same strange sand and tossed it into an empty garden plot. Within moments, the grass grew so tall that it nearly brushed the roof. As the grass swayed in the wind, something more chilling happened. A sound emerged, a low, murmuring voice, like something trying to speak through human lips. Moss's voice shakes as he recalls that moment. The sound still haunts him, even more so after what we saw earlier today. He describes how, out of the grass, a grotesque creature crawled, its skin covered in insect-like eyes and strange flowers, its lips bloated and babbling nonsense. The creature had died moments after emerging, but the image was burned into Moss's mind. Willow, however, was unfazed. Kamer, ever the optimist, was convinced they were on the brink of a scientific breakthrough. But Moss saw something far darker, an abomination. He threw them out of the facility and destroyed any evidence of the night's events, covering the garden plot with cement. For years Moss tried to forget, but his nightmares were reignited when the crate arrived this morning. The thing that crawled out of it was not the first monstrosity Willow had created, and Moss feared it wouldn't be the last. As I listened to his story, I realized this isn't just about science gone wrong. There's a deep, foreboding fear lingering in the air, one that won't be easily erased by the destruction of a single specimen. Dr. Moss looks at me, his eyes heavy with regret. "I'm sorry," he whispers, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for you to be involved." I tell him it's okay, that we'll figure it out, but deep down, I know this isn't over. I've always been a night owl. The last subway ride home, with its solitude and rhythmic clacking, has always felt like the perfect way to end the day. But after what happened last night, I'm not sure I'll ever step onto a subway again. It started like any other Thursday night. I had stayed late at the office, tied up with a project that had been hanging over me for weeks. The streets were unusually quiet as I made my way to the station, the kind of silence that feels almost unnatural in a city that's always bustling. I hurried down the lone escalator, heading into the underground. It wasn't strange for the last ride of the night to be nearly empty. Most people were home by now. The ride down the long escalator was soothing as usual, and my headphones kept me company, drowning out the city's late-night hush. The station I entered was one of the newer ones, clean and modern, a sharp contrast to the emptiness around me. It felt odd being alone in such a public space, but not unusual for this time of night. The train pulled up, its doors sliding open with their usual whoosh. I stepped inside the familiar empty carriage, settling into my seat. The train started moving, and I leaned against the window, watching the tunnel lights flicker past. The train was still moving, but the digital display above the door showed nothing but a blank line. Next station, underscore, 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 underscore. The clock read 1:45, but I should have reached my stop 10 minutes ago. Confused, I tried to shake off the drowsiness, but the tunnel outside was different, completely dark. Not even the faint Lights that usually illuminated the way were visible. Worse, I was alone. Every car I checked was empty. Not a single soul in sight. Panic set in. I approached the intercom to speak to the conductor, but all I got was static. My phone had no signal either, even though the underground system had been equipped with cell service for years. The train just kept moving, as if it had no destination. Frustration turned to fear. I walked through all 7 cars, hoping to find some sign of life, but each was as deserted as the last. Desperation creeping in, I pulled the emergency brake. Nothing. It was as if the train was under someone else's control, someone or something. The minutes ticked by, or so I thought, but when I looked at my watch, it still read 1:45. It was as if time itself had stopped. I tried to distract myself, counting seats, rereading the safety instructions, anything to keep my mind from spiraling, but nothing changed. The darkness outside remained, and the train never slowed down. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that there must be some technical malfunction. But deep down, I knew that no malfunction could explain this endless ride. Hours seemed to pass, though the clock never moved. Exhaustion began to set in. My body was shaking with fear, hunger gnawing at my stomach, but I refused to give in to the rising panic. Desperate for answers, I returned to the conductor's cabin, banging on the door, pleading for help. There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the empty train. Then, just as suddenly as the nightmare had begun, the train began to slow down. My heart raced with hope. I pressed my face against the window, squinting into the darkness, and saw a faint glow ahead. The train came to a stop. The doors opened with a dull clang, and the intercom crackled to life. "In station, please disembark." I stumbled out onto the platform, shaking from fear and exhaustion. The station was just as deserted as the train had been. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted up the escalator, 3 steps at a time, desperate to escape the oppressive underground. Finally, I burst out onto the street, gasping for the cool night air. The city outside seemed unchanged, quiet and normal. My watch now read 1:55. Somehow, despite the hours that had seemed to drag on forever, only 10 minutes had passed. I made it home, collapsing onto my couch, too drained to even think. Since then, I haven't set foot in a subway. I've been taking buses, taxis, anything but that cursed train. No one would believe me if I told them, so I'm writing this as a confession, a way to make sense of it all. I don't expect anyone to take this seriously, but maybe, just maybe, my story will serve as a warning to anyone else who finds themselves alone on a subway late at night. Not every train ride has a destination. Some, it seems, just never stop. I am not young, but I am not exactly old either. Most of you reading this are probably younger than me. I grew up before the time of cell phones and social media, where the internet was still a novelty. Back then, there were no platforms like this to share our strange or scary stories. Maybe if there had been, someone could have helped me, or at least I would have had a better record of what happened than the fragmented memory clouded by years of numbing myself with alcohol. For a long time, I had forgotten about the truth of this incident. That was until a few nights ago, when it all came flooding back in the worst way possible. I think my brain had protected me from the trauma, burying it deep until something triggered the nightmare to resurface. This is that nightmare. The year was 1996. I was 14 years old, living in a small town in California. My parents had decided to move us to a secluded house in the mountains. My dad, tired of the city life, wanted to live where our closest neighbor was nearly a mile away. My older sister, Katie, and I were not thrilled about it. We left behind our friends, and it didn't help that the new school was a whole hour-long bus ride from our home. Katie, who was pretty, outgoing, and popular, made friends easily. I, on the other hand, was awkward, quiet, and always a bit of an outsider. I got picked on a lot. To make matters worse, my father was old school in every sense of the word. He saw the move as an opportunity to toughen me up and teach me some life skills. If you're just going to sit around all summer, you might as well learn something, he said. That's how I found myself helping him with every household task that summer, from cleaning gutters to mowing the lawn, and finally, the job that would change everything, building a woodshed. I say I helped, but in reality, my dad supervised while I did most of the work. It was a simple structure made mostly of old pallets and corrugated aluminum sheets. I was clumsy, cutting myself on the metal sheets more times than I could count. It felt like I was bleeding every day as I worked on that shed. Little did I know that shed would be where it all began. The night I finished the woodshed, my dad actually told me I did a good job. We had dinner, and for the first time I felt a sense of accomplishment. My sister had gone out on her first date, and my parents told me I could stay up late playing video games. It was a rare reward, and, despite my sore hands and exhaustion, I stayed up playing until nearly 1:30 a.m. That's when I first saw it. After shutting off my game, I went to the window and looked outside. I was proud of my work on the shed, but as I stared at it, I saw something, a figure standing next to the shed. At first I thought it was my dad, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I realized it wasn't him. This thing was far too tall, too thin, and its skin was ghostly pale. Its clothes hung in tattered rags, and I could hear a faint tink, tink, tink as its long fingers scraped the side of the shed. Then it looked up at me. Its eyes glowed like an animal caught in headlights. Its face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over its skull. Its mouth was nothing more than a thin line, but as it stared at me, it twitched, moving unnervingly, awake to lowlate. It whispered, though I could hear it clear as day in my mind. I was frozen in place as it continued, "Come out to Pupil play, or I come in." Its head twisted at an unnatural angle as it slowly started to climb the side of the house, its long, bony fingers digging into the walls like some kind of insect. I finally managed to scream for my parents, but it felt like my voice was caught in my throat. Within moments, the creature was at my second-story window. Its pale face pressed against the glass, those horrible eyes locked onto mine. Its thin mouth opened slightly, and I could hear the soft clicking sound of its teeth snapping together. Like the shutter of a camera, I bolted for the door, rushing to my parents' room. I shook my dad, screaming at him to wake up, but he didn't stir. It was like they were in a deep, unnatural sleep. My mother, too, no matter how much I shook them, they remained still. And then I heard the front door creak open. My sister had come home. She was trying to sneak in after her curfew. Not knowing the horror that awaited her, the creature turned its attention away from me and skittered down the hallway like a spider. I heard my sister scream, a blood-curdling sound that I can still hear in my nightmares. By the time I reached the stairs, the creature had already wrapped its skeletal fingers around her throat, cutting off her scream. Her eyes were wide with terror as her life force was drained from her in a way that I still can't fully explain. It was like her very soul was being sucked out, leaving her hair white and her skin ashen. I tried to stop it. I really did, but I was flung aside, crashing into the wall, my leg breaking on impact. I could only watch in helpless agony as my sister's lifeless body collapsed onto the floor, the creature slithering out the front door as quickly as it had appeared. My life was never the same after that night. The police wrote it off as a home invasion gone wrong, saying my sister had died of a heart attack brought on by fear. But I know the truth. I saw that thing drain the life out of her. Years went by, and I did my best to forget. But a few nights ago, it came back. I saw it again, standing by the shed I had built all those years ago. Its glowing eyes fixed on me, and now I know it's only a matter of time before it returns for me. Let me start by saying I really don't want to be writing this, but I feel that it is necessary for my safety to figure out what's going on. Last week, my friend Daniel, not his real name, and I, John again, not my real name, decided we were going to try hiding out overnight in the nearby furniture store. In retrospect, it sounds dumb, but we'd seen videos of people doing this on YouTube. We had just gotten out of university for the summer and didn't have enough money to do anything more exciting. The furniture store was huge. Think of an IKEA if you've ever been to one. It was the size of a warehouse and had 3 stories. Our plan was simple. Stow away under a bed or something until all the employees had left, then just mess around until morning. The store closed at 8 p.m., so we got there at 6 p.m., giving us plenty of time to find hiding places, or there were still enough customers that we wouldn't attract attention from the staff. We went up to the 3rd floor, where there were mostly displays showing furniture arranged in fake rooms. There were all sorts of setups, but in the center of the displays was a dining room with 4 chairs. 3 of the chairs had plastic plates with cartoon characters, and only one had a normal place setting. Daniel and I gave each other a quick glance before racing to sit in the adult chair before the other. Daniel, being a track runner, beat me to it. "Sit down, Sonny," Daniel said with a grin, sitting in the adult chair. "Oh, haha," I replied. "This probably isn't even a kid's chair. They likely just replaced the plates with plastic ones, as the ceramic ones broke. You know, there's only 1 parent and 3 children. Stop complaining, son," Daniel said in a deep voice, mimicking an annoyed father. We both laughed, got up, and continued walking around until it was about 7 p.m. We figured it was time to find hiding spots. Daniel found a kid's room display with a race car bed. "Hell yeah," he yelled out, much too loud for a 20-year-old. "Cover me, high." He bent down, pretending to look at the price tag, while I pretended to take pictures. Once he was hidden under the bed, I began searching for a place of my own. After some looking, I decided hiding under a bed was my best option. I chose a king-size bed that had a good view of the dining room in the center, and further away the race car bed where Daniel was hiding. We texted back and forth, playing rock, paper, scissors, until I got bored. I decided to turn the brightness down on my phone and doom scroll until the store emptied out. Suddenly, I was startled by a sharp screech echoing through the air. I glanced at my phone. It was exactly 8 p.m. I thought it was strange that a store alarm would go off at closing time, but then it got even weirder. All the staff began ushering the remaining customers out of the store with an urgency I had never seen before. Daniel and I exchanged frantic texts, but we reassured ourselves that it was probably some policy to make sure no employees stayed overtime. By 8:05 p.m., the 3rd floor was dead silent, and from what I could see, no one was left. I texted Daniel one last time, telling him we should wait until the lights went out before coming out of our hiding spots. Then my phone died. Thanks to my TikTok addiction, I waited in the dark for what felt like 10 to 15 minutes, trying to relax. That's when the metal double doors that led to the storage room burst open, and a dozen women, dressed in formal attire, marched out in a single file line. They were all carrying different objects: a bottle of water, a bottle of wine, a basket with napkins and silverware, a candle, a metal figurine of some sort, a covered platter, 3 folded blankets, 1 green, 1 red, 1 blue, and 3 3-foot-tall dolls. I stared in disbelief as the women set the table meticulously. The metal figurine was placed in front of the adult chair, and the dolls, 1 with red hair, 1 blonde, and 1 brown-haired, were seated in the children's chairs. Then 3 women with blankets began moving toward the outer parts of the showroom. 1 with a green blanket went to the kids' room display on my left. Another with a red blanket moved to a display on my right, and the 1 with the blue blanket headed directly toward the race car bed where Daniel was hiding. My heart raced. She placed the blue blanket over the race car bed, and I caught Daniel's eyes. His face had gone pale. The women retreated back through the double doors as orderly as they had come, leaving the eerie scene behind. Daniel and I exchanged looks, utterly bewildered. What was this? A late-night display setup? And what were the dolls for? Before we could make sense of it, a man dressed in a dark red suit emerged from the same doors. He walked over to the remaining chair, placed his hand on it, and spoke coldly. "Hello, children." The way he said it sent shivers down my spine. I instinctively reached for my phone to record, but I remembered it was dead. I waved my hand toward Daniel, signaling him to record with his phone. He nodded and began filming. Meanwhile, the man sat down at the table and started pouring water for the dolls. He spoke softly to them as if they were real children. It was unsettling. I pressed myself against the headboard, trying to distance myself from the scene. From where I was, I could no longer see the table, but I could hear the man talking in a low, creepy tone. I stayed there, curled up against the wall, for what felt like an hour. Then a lone chair squeaked as it was pushed back. The man stood and said, "Time for bed." "Why, lovelies," in a soft but chilling voice. He picked up the blonde-haired doll and began walking toward the race car bed toward Daniel. I watched in horror as he laid the doll down on the bed, covering it with the blanket. "I love you," the man whispered, giving the doll a sickening kiss on the cheek. Daniel, visibly shaking, grabbed his phone and crawled out from under the bed as soon as the man turned away. He sprinted toward the stairs, giving me a quick glance filled with fear and regret. The man, noticing Daniel's escape, froze and stared at him with pure hatred. Without a word, 2 of the women from earlier appeared, one carrying a revolver and the other a shotgun. They offered the weapons to the man. He took the revolver and fired a single shot at Daniel. The bullet missed, and Daniel disappeared down the stairs. The man handed the gun back to the woman, and the women disappeared into the storage room again. The man continued tucking in the dolls as if nothing had happened, whispering "I love you" to each of them. Then he turned, picked up the metal figurine, and began walking toward the doors. But just as he was about to leave, he stopped. "It's rude to stare, you know," he said loudly, his voice echoing across the empty floor. My heart dropped. How had he seen me? I knew I had to run. I crawled out from under the bed and bolted toward the stairs as fast as I could. "I think I'll be seeing you for dinner soon," he called after me. "And your friend as well." I ran down the stairs, out the front doors, and didn't stop until I was far from the store. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I eventually found my way to a nearby mall. I spent the rest of the night in the food court, charging my phone. As soon as I had a bit of battery, I called Daniel, but he didn't answer. I texted him and tried messaging him on social media, but it looked like he had deleted all of his accounts. I thought maybe he was just embarrassed until this morning, when I woke up to a message from an unknown number. There was no text, just two emojis, a fork and a plate. I don't feel safe anymore. They have my number. Either they've gotten to Daniel, or they know who I am, both terrifying possibilities. I could go to the police, but without the video Daniel took, my story would sound insane. Has anyone ever heard of a cult like this? Any advice would be greatly appreciated. I'm starting this off with a story that shows how housekeepers can be pretty great house guests if treated right. Of course, first, if you're unfamiliar with what Orion Pest Control does, you might want to start with some background. But I'll dive right in here. This case started out like many others. The client called us, didn't take our advice seriously, and then got shocked when their actions led to some weird consequences. Luckily, this client figured things out fast enough before the situation got worse before the housekeeper transformed. Quick side note, I really don't understand why some people have such a hard time treating their housekeepers with basic decency. These suburban folks act all posh, but when it comes to something as simple as offering a bowl of cream to what's basically a mystical maid, they get all stubborn. Anyway, things got a little crazy, and the housekeeper somehow ended up inside the walls. The call for help. As soon as I stepped into the house, I could hear the muffled grumbling of the housekeeper. The homeowner sat nervously in the living room, tapping his foot while scratching noses echoed from above. I wasn't sure if the housekeeper had fully transformed yet, but since it hadn't attacked the client, there was still hope we could reason with it. The guy sheepishly admitted that things had been fine with the housekeeper until that morning, when it got itself stuck in the walls. He had no idea how it even happened. I sighed and gave him the plan. All right, I'm going to try to get it out without getting either of us killed. You should find somewhere safe to hang out, and I'll probably need to call someone to back me up. He nodded, muttered something about calling him when it was safe, and left quickly. I called Victor to help out while glassware rattled around me. The housekeeper let out an ear-piercing screech, signaling it was not happy. Victor's first question was blunt. How the hell did it get in the walls? I have no idea, I said, rubbing my temples. I'll check things out, maybe find an entry point. Don't engage until I get there, Victor warned. It's probably more aggressive being stuck like that, I agreed, and grabbed the toolbox from the truck. My first thought was the attic. It's possible it found a hole and just fell in. Housekeepers don't burrow. They prefer living in comfy, civilized spaces, so I knew it was probably as mad about this situation as the homeowner was. 3. Finding the housekeeper in the attic, I found a hole in the insulation. Maybe rodents were involved, but something odd caught my eye. Gray feathers scattered around. Birds, maybe? Then I heard the housekeeper swearing loudly, followed by more scratching. Everything all right in there? I called out, trying to sound friendly. Yeah, just peachy, it yelled sarcastically. I love being stuck in here. At least it was still talking, which meant it hadn't transformed yet. That was a good sign. Look, I didn't mean to patronize you. Could you knock on the wall so I can figure out the best way to get you out of there? I asked, staying calm. After some grumbling, it knocked. I followed the sound and located the room where the knocks were loudest. Pressing my ear to the wall, I called out, "How much space do you have in there?" "About 2 feet on either side," it replied gruffly. "Okay, I've got some cables in the truck. I'll lower one down to you and pull you out." The housekeeper sounded dubious. "You're gonna fish me out." "It's worth a try, stay put," I replied, realizing how dumb that sounded the moment it left my mouth. Where else am I gonna go? Take a stroll under the floorboards? It snarked. The rescuer grabbed the cable from the truck and returned to the attic. I wasn't sure if it would be long enough to reach the housekeeper, but busting a hole in the client's wall was the last thing I wanted to do. It'd take more time and cost them extra for repairs. I got into position and slowly lowered the cable a bit to the right. It shouted, "No, my right, your left." After a few minutes, I felt a weight on the other end. "You ready?" I asked. "Yeah." "Pull me up." I started hauling the housekeeper up. They're surprisingly light, must be mostly fur or something. Finally, I saw two small, hairy hands grasp the opening. Being careful, I grabbed its wrists and pulled. Right then, Victor walked in, just as the housekeeper slipped. I caught it mid-air and suddenly found myself holding it like a child on my hip. None of us were happy about it, especially the housekeeper. I parked the Jeep and shut off the engine, the eerie silence of the surroundings immediately pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, like the land itself was warning us to turn back. Iolo stared out at the entrance, his face unreadable. "You sure we have to do this tonight?" I asked, unable to shake the sense of impending doom. Iolo didn't even look at me, his voice cool and detached. "Those worms won't wait. If we don't handle this now, it'll be too late." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "All right, let's get this over with." We both exited the Jeep, the crunch of gravel under our feet sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I reached for my gear in the back, a satchel of salt, a flashlight, and my hagstone still safely around my neck. Iolo, however, didn't seem to need much. He carried a strange old lantern, dimly glowing with a soft, unnatural light. Its eerie, flickering flame cast long, distorted shadows across the rocky terrain. As we approached the mine's entrance, Iolo glanced over at me. "Remember, pup, stay close and keep that salt handy. Once we're inside, things are going to get unpleasant." I nodded, gripping the satchel tightly as we stepped into the darkness. The cold immediately wrapped around me like a shroud, the air inside the mine musty and stale. It felt like stepping into a tomb. The mine was old, long abandoned, with wooden beams creaking ominously above our heads. Dust particles floated lazily in the dim light of Iolo's lantern. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I could hear distant scurrying, whether it was the worms or something else. I couldn't tell. "What's the plan?" I asked in a whisper, my voice sounding too loud in the cramped space. Iolo glanced over his shoulder, his expression serious. "We find the nest, the queen. She's the one laying the eggs. Once we salt her, the rest will die off." "Great," I muttered. "Sounds simple enough, but I knew it wouldn't be. Nothing ever was when it came to these creatures. The last time I'd encountered the worms, I barely made it out alive, and the thought of facing their queen made my skin crawl. As we ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in on us. The mine's structure was fragile, and the weight of the mountain above us pressed down, a constant reminder that we were far from safety. The ground beneath my feet felt softer, almost damp. Something slithered past my boot, and I jumped. But Iolo didn't even flinch. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a larger cavern. It was pitch black, save for the faint glow of Iolo's lantern. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air smelled of decay. In the center of the cavern, I could just make out a writhing mass, dozens, maybe hundreds of the worms, coiled and twisted together like some nightmarish tapestry. Iolo stepped forward, holding the lantern high. "There," he said quietly, nodding toward the far side of the cavern, and then I saw her. The queen, she was massive, her bloated, translucent body pulsating with movement as smaller worms crawled in and out of her flesh. Her eyes dark, lifeless, seemed to stare right through me, and her mouth, if you could call it that, was lined with jagged teeth, gnashing as she fed on the air around her. I gagged, feeling bile rise in my throat. How do we get close enough to assault her? Iolo gave me a sharp look. Carefully, he moved first, stepping closer to the queen, his lantern casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The Vorms reacted to his presence, their movements becoming agitated. I followed, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn and run. We were almost within striking distance when the queen let out a deafening shriek, her body convulsing as if she sensed the danger. The smaller Vorms began to swarm, slithering toward us with unnatural speed. Now, Iolo barked, tossing a handful of salt into the air. I fumbled with my satchel, but managed to fling the salt toward the queen. The reaction was immediate. The Vorms writhed in agony as the salt touched their skin, their flesh sizzling and melting away. The queen let out another ear-splitting scream, her body thrashing violently, but it wasn't over yet. As the salt took effect, the cavern began to shake, the wooden supports groaning under the strain. Rocks tumbled from the ceiling, and Iolo grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the entrance. "We have to get out of here," he shouted over the nose. I didn't argue. We sprinted toward the tunnel, the ground shaking beneath our feet. Behind us, the queen let out one final, monstrous wail before the cavern collapsed in on itself, sealing her and the remaining Vorms inside. We barely made it out in time. The mine entrance crumbled behind us, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the night air. I coughed, wiping the grime from my face as I stumbled away from the wreckage. Iolo stood beside me, surprisingly calm despite the chaos we just escaped. He glanced at the mine, then at me. "Well, that was fun, I wheezed. "That was a nightmare," he grinned, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "Welcome to my world, pup." I shot him a glare but said nothing, too exhausted to argue. All I wanted was a shower and about 10 hours of sleep. As Iolo started walking back to the jeep, he added, "By the way, your brakes are still shit." I groaned. "I'll get them fixed, all right." "Good, I'll be seeing you soon." Then I wasn't sure if that was a promise or a threat. Either way, I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time I'd find myself dealing with the Vorms, or with Iolo. We drove back in silence, the weight of the night still heavy on my shoulders. The mechanic and I proceeded cautiously through the cavern, our footsteps echoing in the depth silence. My nerves were shot, the oppressive weight of the underground pressing against me, and the white stag's lingering presence in my mind didn't help. Even though I tried to shake the memories of the horrific beast, every scrape of my boot on the rocks seemed to remind me of the white, slimy fur, and those Vorms, those Vorms. I couldn't help but glance at Iolo, who seemed as calm as ever. It was unnerving how he could walk through these situations without breaking a sweat. After everything we had just faced, he didn't seem rattled at all, but me. I felt the need to scratch my skin raw, convinced that there was still something crawling beneath the surface. I kept checking my neck for any sign of movement, of the Vorm's telltale squirming. So far, nothing. Yet the fear was enough to drive me mad. The hospital tests had been clear, no parasites. Still, my paranoia wouldn't subside. Every twitch or tingle set my mind racing back to that moment, and I'd felt the worm tear into my neck. And then Iolo, the way he had so casually saved me by sucking the Vorms out. Who does that? But something had changed between us after that. He had saved me, yes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had gained something from it. What did he mean by saying I had a built-in hexstone against him? What new limitations did he have? These questions swirled in my head, making it difficult to sleep, to rest. The white stag's presence in my dreams wasn't helping either. It never did anything in my dreams, just stood there, silently watching, always in the corner of my vision, never moving, but ever present. I couldn't tell whether it was some sort of warning or a residual effect of the worm's parasitic influence. One night, however, the dream was different. I was standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the same familiar trees from my childhood. There was an eerie calm in the air, no wind, no sound, just a thick, overwhelming stillness. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the white stag. Its antlers were sharper than I remembered, more jagged. The slime on its fur seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. It didn't move toward me. It just watched. I tried to walk away, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground was trying to pull me down. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin, and I began to panic. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from that thing. But I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in the white stag's gaze. And then, just like that, I woke up. But even awake, I could still feel the weight of its eyes on me. After days of restless sleep and constant anxiety, I started seeing the stag in my waking life, too. I'd be driving down a familiar road, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see a flash of white fur in the woods. Or I'd glance at the window late at night and swear I saw the gleam of those jagged antlers in the darkness. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I started to wonder if the bite had left more than just a physical mark on me. Maybe those worms had done something to my mind, or maybe I had spent too much time with Iolo, and whatever darkness surrounded him was starting to seep into me too. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I knew there was only one person who could give them to me. I grabbed my keys and headed back to where I knew I'd find him, out in the woods. Where the white stag had first appeared, Iolo was there, as I expected, sitting on a rock, plucking at his banjo. The same smug grin spread across his face as I approached. "Took you long enough," he said without looking up. "I need to know what's going on with me," I demanded, my voice shaking with frustration. He finally looked up, his eyes gleaming with that same unsettling confidence. "Still seeing the stag, are you?" I nodded, my heart racing. "It's in my dreams, and I see ... during the day sometimes. I can't tell if it's real or if it's just ... In my head, Iolo chuckled darkly, plucking another string on his banjo. "That's what happens when you're marked by something like that. The white stag ain't just a creature, it's a symbol. It's part of something much bigger than you or me." I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around what he was saying. "So ... what does that mean for me? Am I infected?" "Nah," he said with a casual wave of his hand. "You're clean, at least physically. But you've been touched by something ancient, something that don't let go so easily. That stag ... It's got its eye on you now." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. "So what do I do?" Iolo stood up, slinging the banjo over his shoulder. "You've got two choices. You can run, try to live your life like nothing ever happened. But that stag will always be there, in the corner of your mind, watching, waiting, or ... you face it head on. You go back to where it all started and confront it." My stomach churned at the thought of going back to that mine, to the place where the white stag had first appeared. But deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. If I didn't face it now, it would haunt me for the rest of my life. I looked at Iolo, his eyes gleaming with something that looked like approval. "How do I do that?" His smile widened. "Oh, I think you'll figure that out when the time comes. Just be ready, Pop. The white stag ain't done with you yet." As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but feel like I was stepping into a nightmare I'd never wake up from. The white stag was out there, waiting for me, and sooner or later, I'd have to face it. But this time I wouldn't be running. This time I'd be ready, or at least I hope I would be. Grandma always warned us, beware the light-eyed ones. It was a mantra passed down from her to my mom, aunts, uncles, and eventually to us, or grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Too many of us, it seemed a strange superstition, a relic of her past. She said Grandma made it her mission to ensure every child and grandchild had shades of brown in their eyes, be it dark, light, amber, or hazel. It was almost obsessive, to the point where she allegedly fought with doctors, insisting on a way to make sure none of us were born with blue, green, or gray eyes. This fixation extended to every facet of our lives. She forbade her children from dating anyone with light-colored eyes. One of my uncles almost got disowned for dating a green-eyed girl. Friends, they had to have brown eyes too. Even when we went to restaurants, she would make sure the wait staff had dark eyes before she'd feel comfortable dining there. We all found it odd, but nobody questioned it. Any time we asked why, her response was always the same: beware the light-eyed ones. It wasn't until I visited her on her deathbed a few days ago that I finally learned the truth. Grandma was 86, frail and pale, lying in her bed as if life itself was slipping away from her minute by minute. Yet, when I sat beside her, she reached for my hand with surprising strength. "Listen," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I've kept something from all of you. Not even your grandpa knew, and he took so many of my secrets to the grave. But I have to tell someone before I leave this world." I was taken aback but agreed to listen. I had no idea that what she was about to tell me would leave me terrified. "As you know, I've always been wary of people with light eyes," she began. "It wasn't always that way. When I was a little girl, most people in my town had dark eyes, but there were a few, very few, who had light eyes, and those people, they were dangerous." She told me about the day that changed her life forever. She was in the 3rd grade, walking to school like any other day, when a young man and woman appeared in her path. They looked to be in their mid-20s, both with unnaturally beautiful eyes. The man's were a bright emerald green, and the woman's were a striking mixture of blue and silver gray. Grandma didn't think much of it at the time. She was a well-behaved child and knew not to talk to strangers. But as she tried to walk around them, something cold and firm grabbed her from behind. She was thrown to the ground, and before she could scream, the man had her in a chokehold, while the woman stared down at her with lifeless eyes. Their faces were plastered with unsettling smiles, and the last thing she saw before losing consciousness was those eerie, light-colored eyes. When she awoke, she found herself tied to a tree, gagged and helpless by the lake where she had learned to swim as a child. The man and woman who had attacked her emerged from the woods, and for others joined them. They all had the same blank expression and unblinking, pale eyes, green, blue, gray, old shades devoid of warmth or humanity. They said I was going to get new, pretty eyes so that they could have a child in their new world, she whispered, her voice trembling. The man pulled out a silver spoon from his pocket. He said it was time to make me perfect. I shuddered as she recalled how the man inched closer, the spoon hovering near her left eye. But just as he was about to proceed, gunshots rang out. The man dropped the spoon and fell dead. A group of hunters had been in the woods that day and had stumbled upon the scene. They shot the kidnappers, saving Grandma's life. But the horror didn't end there. One of the women, though wounded, survived and was later interrogated. She revealed that the group was part of a cult known as the Light-Eyed Ones. They believed that everyone in the world should have light eyes, and they were willing to do anything, including abducting children and replacing their eyes with glass ones to achieve their goal. For weeks they had been watching Grandma, waiting for the perfect moment to take her and convert her. I never told anyone about the note they left for me later, Grandma confessed. I found it on my dresser a few days after the incident. It said the light-eyed ones are still watching, and they will come for you soon. Fearful for her life, she had kept the secret, but it haunted her for decades. Every time she saw someone with light eyes, she would relive the terror of that day. Her obsession with keeping her family safe from the light-eyed ones had consumed her entire life. Grandma finished her story in tears, and I hugged her tightly, unsure of what to say. How could I comfort someone who had lived with such fear for so long? I left that day feeling shaken, but glad that I could be there for her in her final moments. As I exited the hospital, I passed by a nurse who smiled at me. Her eyes were a striking blue. I smiled back, but as I walked away, I could have sworn I heard her whisper under her breath, "You will join the light-eyed ones one day." The words sent a chill down my spine, and now I can't shake the feeling that maybe Grandma's fears weren't as irrational as they seemed. I never imagined I'd find myself back in my old hometown. Life has a way of pulling you back to the places you thought you'd left behind for good. We moved here for the quiet life, for our daughter to grow up in a safe neighborhood, but there are shadows, your memories, and ghosts that linger, refusing to fade. The house next door had been empty for years. When a moving truck finally appeared, I didn't think much of it. People come and go. It was just another family looking for a fresh start. But then I saw her, Alyssa, the girl who had a massive crush on me in high school. The girl who had died in a car accident during senior year. It couldn't be her. Of course, the woman who moved in had a different name, different hair, but those eyes. I'd never forget those eyes. They were the same haunting, intense eyes that Alyssa had. It unnerved me, but I shook it off. After all, people often resemble someone from our past, right? The woman introduced herself as Lisa, all smiles and pleasantries. She seemed friendly enough during the day, polite in that distant, neighborly way. But at night, things changed. I would wake up in the dead of night with a strange, uneasy feeling. I'd go to the window and see her standing at her window, staring. And every time, her eyes would be locked directly on our house, on me. She never moved, never blinked, just stared. At first, I tried to tell Sarah, my wife. "You're just stressed," she said, brushing it off with a laugh. "Moving can be overwhelming, especially back to your old hometown." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. As the nights went on, I saw Alyssa more and more, that stared those lifeless eyes. I couldn't get them out of my mind. One night, the unease turned into something more. I woke to the sound of a creaking floorboard, the kind that groans under the weight of someone moving stealthily. I reached over to wake Sarah, but she wasn't in bed. My heart started racing as I rushed downstairs. The living room was empty, but the front door was slightly ajar. Stepping outside into the cold night air, I spotted them. Lisa was standing at the edge of our yard, staring as she always did. But this time, Sarah was with her, standing beside her, her eyes wide and vacant like she was in some sort of trance. I called out Sarah's name, my voice cracking with fear, but she didn't respond. Lisa slowly turned her head, her dead eyes locking onto mine. She leaned toward Sarah and whispered something in her ear, something I couldn't hear. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I shouted, my voice trembling with desperation. She didn't answer. She walked right past me, her eyes glazed over. and went straight to bed as if nothing had happened. I stood there in the dark, frozen with terror, Lisa's words echoing in my mind. She belongs to me now. The next morning, Sarah remembered none of it. She laughed off my concerns, said I was probably just dreaming, but her eyes, they weren't the same. Something had changed. Every night after that, it happened again. I would wake up to find Sarah standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. Sometimes Lisa would be there too, standing in her window, both of them side by side, and moving, watching the night. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The last night Sarah was in the house, I woke up to find her gone again. I searched the entire house, calling her name until my voice was hoarse, but she was nowhere. I ran outside, the cold biting at my skin, but there was no sign of her, only an empty yard, the street eerily silent. The police found no trace, no evidence of where she could have gone. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Now, every night I sit by the window, just like Sarah used to, watching and waiting. I keep hoping this nightmare will end, that maybe I'll see her again, but deep down I know the truth. Alyssa, no, Lisa has taken everything from me. She's taken my wife, my life, and I fear I'm next. At first, it was just a small bruise on his cheek. I didn't think much of it when I pressed my husband about it. He said it was from an accident at work. Accidents happen, I told myself. But it seemed odd since he worked at a desk job, punching numbers into a computer all day. It wasn't exactly the kind of place where injuries were common. The next night, however, he came home with a black eye, and his excuse wasn't going to cut it this time. When he arrived, he avoided me like the plague. That's when I knew something was wrong. "What happened to your eye, honey?" I asked, trying to sound casual even though my insides were churning with worrying. He hesitated, clearly trying to come up with a believable story. "Some jerk cut in front of me at the gas station," he finally said. When I confronted him, he just lost it and punched me. Now, my husband has never been a good liar. In fact, he's terrible at it. "That's terrible," I replied, playing along. "Did you report him?" He shook his head. "Didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Just paid for my gas and got out of there." But I knew he was lying. I could see it in his eyes. And as the days passed, his injuries kept getting worse, his lies more elaborate. Each night, he'd come home battered and bruised, and with every new injury, he became more distant. He was still my husband, but something about him was changing, slipping away, piece by piece. One evening, he stumbled through the door, barely able to stand. His face was pale, drawn with pain, and I could see a fresh injury, his arm hanging limply at his side. My heart skipped a beat when I noticed the bone jutting grotesquely through the skin. "Oh my God, what happened to you?" I rushed to him, trying to support his weight as he collapsed into my arms. He could barely speak, his breath shallow and labored. I took him to the hospital immediately. The doctor, a calm and measured man, pulled me aside after treating my husband's arm. "You're the fourth couple I've seen this week with injuries like these," the doctor said, his voice laced with suspicion. "It's not unusual for people to get hurt, but what is odd is the explanations. They're all the same." His words echoed in my mind the whole drive home. He worked in an office downtown, so when he started driving in the opposite direction, I knew something was off. He drove for miles until he stopped outside an old, abandoned building far from the city. I watched as he sat in his car, waiting. Soon, other cars pulled up, and men just as bruised and battered as my husband got out. That's when it clicked. My husband's favorite movie was Fight Club, and I'd heard that underground fight clubs existed. But never in a million years did I think my mild-mannered husband would be involved in something like that? I waited until they disappeared inside the building before sneaking out of my car. I crept to one of the dusty windows and peered inside. What I saw was nothing like what I expected. The men had stripped down, all standing in a line as men in white overalls collected their clothes, and then a giant praying mantis emerged from one of the doors. My breath caught in my throat, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The creature towered over the men who stood there, unmoving, like they were awaiting their fate. Then one of them stepped forward and started doing a strange, rhythmic dance. The praying mantis watched, swaying in time with the man's movements. Then, without warning, the creature lashed out, sending the man flying across the floor. Next, my husband stepped forward. He began doing the same strange dance, as if he were trying to impress the giant insect. I felt sick to my stomach as I watched the creature wrap its forelegs around him, pulling him close. What happened next was beyond horrifying. The praying mantis began mating with him, and just as I was about to run back to my car, I saw it. The creature bit down on his head, tearing it clean off, while my husband's body convulsed. The horror I felt was indescribable. I wanted to scream, to cry, but I was paralyzed with fear. I watched as the men in white overalls dragged his headless body away and took it to another room. Shaking, I stumbled around back of the building. Through another window, I saw bright lights and heat lamps hanging over a collection of enormous eggs. Some were rattling, ready to hatch. I was barely processing the fact that I had just watched my husband die when I saw something even more terrifying. A man who looked exactly like my husband emerged from one of the eggs. The men in white overalls dressed him in the same clothes my husband had been wearing. I ran back to my car and sped home, my mind reeling. When I got there, I sat in the kitchen, trembling, trying to decide if I should pack my bags and leave. But before I could, I heard his car pull into the driveway. I froze as the door opened, and there he was, my husband, or at least the thing that looked like him. He walked into the kitchen with a big smile on his face, all of his injuries miraculously healed. "What happened to your broken arm?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "And don't lie to me, I followed you. I saw everything." For a moment he looked startled, as if caught in a lie, but then his face softened. "I didn't want to worry you," he said calmly. "I was dying. I had stage 4 stomach cancer. That creature, it saved me. I feel better than ever. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw it a thin, green, translucent film flickered across them as he blinked, and a cold shiver of dread washed over me. The man standing in front of me was not my husband. Not anymore. The grass swayed like waves beneath our feet as we approached Hawkinson's farm. The golden sun hung low, casting long shadows that danced across the field, enhancing the ocean-like illusion. Despite the warmth of the day, a chill ran down my spine as I recalled Mr. Stevens' warning. Sharks in the grass. It was absurd, yet something in his tone had made me uneasy. "Come on, Captain. What's the matter? Scared of a little grass?" Henry teased, his eyes sparkling with mischief. He grabbed my hand, and we took off running, our laughter echoing into the evening air. It was our tradition to ignore warnings, to sail boldly into our imagined world, leaving fears behind like forgotten sails. As we reached the edge of the field, we paused, taking in the vastness before us. The grass towered over our heads, creating a labyrinth of green. "It's perfect," Henry said, his voice filled with excitement. "Just like the ocean. Let's find our treasure." With that, we plunged into the swaying sea of grass, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the soft earth. We moved further in, searching for hidden gaps and pirate loot, our imaginations propelling us deeper. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Then we stumbled upon something unusual, a circle of flattened grass, different from the rest of the field. It looked almost like a whirlpool, swirling inward, as if the grass had been disturbed by some unseen force. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Look at this," I called out, kneeling to inspect the oddity. "Do you think this is where the treasure is buried?" Henry stepped closer, peering at the circle. "Maybe it's where the sharks hide," he joked, but there was an edge to his laughter. I could tell he felt it too, the weight of something wrong. "Let's keep looking," I suggested, wanting to dismiss the growing sense of dread. But as we wandered further into the field, the sun disappeared and shadows deepened. The wind picked up, rustling the grass ominously, and for the first time the field felt alive and threatening. "Do you hear that?" Henry asked suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper. I strained to listen, and my heart dropped. It was a low, resonant growl, like a beast stirring from sleep. "We should go back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but fear crept into my tone. "Just a little longer. I want to see what's in the middle of the field." Henry insisted, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Before I could respond, a dark shape moved through the grass just out of sight. It was large and low, moving silently, almost predatorily. My heart raced as I grabbed Henry's arm. "We need to go now." We turned to run, but the growl grew louder, reverberating through the ground beneath our feet. Panic surged as we sprinted toward the edge of the field. The sound was close behind us, echoing like thunder in the distance. Faster. I yelled, my breath coming in gasps. I could almost feel the heat of whatever was chasing us. As we broke free from the grass and into the safety of the road, we dared to look back. Nothing, just the field, swaying gently in the twilight. What was that? Henry breathed, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to catch my breath. "But I don't want to find out." We ran all the way back to town, hearts pounding and adrenaline coursing through our veins. The safety of familiar streets surrounded us, and with each step, the terror from the field faded, replaced by the laughter of our earlier adventures. But deep down, I knew we could never return to that ocean of grass. Mr. Stevens' words echoed in my mind, a warning I had ignored too easily. Whatever lurked in that field was real, and the treasure he sought was nothing compared to the dangers hidden beneath the surface. As the stars twinkled above, I glanced back at the field one last time, a silhouette against the darkening sky. I cried, clutching his shoulders tighter. The boy was a hungry beast, creeping up his legs, ready to consume him whole. "You can't leave me." For a moment he blinked, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, those vibrant greens I cherished. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice shaky but steady. "I'm not going anywhere." But as he spoke, the darkness pulsed, and I felt a tremor beneath our feet. The ground beneath us seemed to breathe, in and out, pulling and pushing, threatening to tear us apart. I could feel the desperation rise within me like a wave, threatening to drown us both. "Take my hand, Henry," I urged, holding my breath. "Let's pull back together. We can fight this." With a determined shake of his head, he turned to face the encroaching void. "We can't let it win. We'll find a way out." Just as the words left his mouth, the ground quaked, and a rush of wind surged through the grass, tossing it wildly. It was as if the entire field was alive, warning us, urging us to flee. I felt the panic swell inside my chest. "Run," I shouted, gripping his hand tightly. Together, we turned, our feet pounding against the hard earth, tearing ourselves away from the gaping hole that threatened to swallow us whole. The darkness howled behind us, a roar that reverberated through my bones. Each step felt like a battle against an invisible force, as if the very grass sought to hold us back, to drag us into its depths. "Keep going. Do not look back," I yelled, pulling Henry along. With every stride, I could feel his grip tighten around my hand, the warmth of his skin a lifeline amidst the chaos. The field, once our sanctuary, now felt like a twisted maze, each blade of grass transformed into an enemy, trying to trip us, to ensnare us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke free from the field and stumbled onto the dirt road. The air was cooler, clearer, and the oppressive darkness behind us seemed to recede, but we did not stop. We ran as fast as our legs could carry us, hearts racing, until we reached the safety of the familiar town. "Henry," I gasped, pulling him into a tight hug. "We made it. We're okay." He nodded, his breath heavy, but his eyes flickering with the remnants of fear. "But what was that?" he asked, trembling slightly. "I do not know," I admitted, pulling away to look at him. "But we cannot go back. We just can't." He nodded solemnly, his shoulders drooping slightly. "You think it was real, the darkness?" "It felt real," I whispered, my heart still pounding. As we stood there, catching our breath, the town loomed around us, its lights twinkling like stars against the darkening sky. A sense of normalcy returned, but the shadow of the field hung over us like a storm cloud. "We should tell someone," Henry suggested, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Who would believe us?" I replied, glancing back at the grasslands that now seemed menacing in the twilight. "Mr. Stevens, he warned us." "He knew something," Henry nodded slowly, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. "Then we should go see him. He might know what to do." Together, we walked toward the barber shop, the familiar sound of the bell ringing as we entered. Mr. Stevens was sitting in his chair, a warm smile on his face. But as soon as he saw us, that smile faded into a look of concern. "What happened to you boys?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "Double quotes, we ... "We found something in the field," I stammered, unable to shake the memories of the void. "There was a hole of darkness. It almost took Henry." Mr. Stevens' eyes darkened, and he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You should not have gone there," he said gravely. "The grass does not welcome strangers lightly." "What do you mean?" Henry asked, fear creeping into his voice. "There are stories," Mr. Stevens replied, looking between us, his gaze piercing. "Tales of things that dwell in the shadows. Things that can take a person and leave nothing but a husk behind. That field is not what it seems. It is a place of forgotten memories and lost souls." A shiver ran down my spine, and I could see the fear reflected in Henry's eyes. So it was real. I whispered, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Yes," he said slowly, "and it will always be there, waiting for those who dare to venture to close." Suddenly I felt small, like a child lost in a world far too big and terrifying. But I knew, more than anything, that I could not let fear dictate my life. "We are safe now, right?" I asked, looking to Mr. Stevens for reassurance. "For now," he replied, his expression grave. "But remember, the darkness does not forget. It will always seek to reclaim what it has lost." As we left the barber shop, a heaviness settled over us. We walked home in silence, the shadows stretching long behind us, the memory of the hole still fresh in my mind. The fields might seem innocent from afar, but now I knew the truth. They were a veil hiding something sinister, and as long as I lived, I would never forget what lurked beneath the surface of that ocean of grass. I've never been superstitious or prone to believing in things like ghosts or the supernatural. However, I've always had an uneasy relationship with mirrors. Ever since I was a kid, I would catch strange glimpses of movement in my reflection, something darting out of sight when I walked past a mirror. When I was younger, it was unsettling but manageable. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination, a natural fear of dark corners and basement staircases. But the mirror in my parents' bathroom was a different story. It wasn't just a basement or a shadow in the corner of my eye. I started seeing things. Specifically them. I called them mirror goblins, though goblin is probably not the right word. It just stuck because they were small, humanoid figures about the size of a cat with oversized heads, gangly limbs, and always smiling. Some were green, some were gray, some even looked flesh-colored, but their smiles were all the same to wide, to knowing. They never hurt me or came out of the mirror, but I could feel them watching me, like they were waiting for something. For a long time, I avoided looking into that mirror. It wasn't just about brushing my teeth or washing my face. I would disrobe behind the shower curtain, open the medicine cabinet, so I didn't have to see my reflection, anything to avoid eye contact with them. They didn't scare me in a monster in the closet kind of way. It was more like they were trying to get into my head. Then, when I hit 12, they disappeared. I stopped seeing the goblins, and my fear of the mirror subsided. I told myself it was part of growing up. You know how kids stop believing in monsters under the bed. I thought it was the same thing, but something else started happening. My reflection started acting strange. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight delay in my reflection's movements. But then it started smiling. Not a normal smile, though I wasn't smiling. The reflection would just sit there, grinning at me even though I stood in front of it with a blank face. At first, it would last a second or two, but as time went on, it stretched out longer and longer. By my senior year of high school, it could take up to 30 seconds before the smile would fade. Life wasn't great during those years. I was dealing with a lot of emotional issues and depression, and I wasn't exactly a happy person. My resting face became gloomy, almost sullen, but my reflection, it was just so damn happy. It drove me nuts. I wasn't smiling. So why the hell was my reflection? The night that finally pushed me over the edge was during one of my many bouts of insomnia. It was around 4 a.m., and I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom. The house was dead silent, not a single sound, and yet there it was, smiling at me. I don't know why, but I kept watching. Then it started laughing. It wasn't audible. It was like watching someone laughing on mute, their face contorting with joy but without a sound. And still, I just stared, feeling nothing. No fear, no frustration, just emptiness. The next morning, I woke up with blood on my pillow and a razor blade on the bathroom sink. My face was covered in clean, straight cuts. The weird part was, we didn't own a razor like the one I found. The blades in our house were all rusted old, shoved behind the mirror into the wall because you couldn't just throw them out back in the day. But this one was new, pristine. I had no idea where it came from. I told everyone I fell into a blackberry bush. No one really bought it, but no one asked questions either. Then, not long after, it happened again. I got spooked by my reflection and, in a panic, punched the mirror. The glass shattered, cutting my hands and torso. But instead of getting angry, my mom just gave me a worried look and told me it was okay. That was it. We never spoke about it again. Once the mirror was replaced, things went back to normal. My reflection was just my reflection again. No weird smiles, no goblins, I went off to college, started a new chapter, and eventually moved in with my partner. Life was good, and I honestly thought I'd left all that behind me. That was until yesterday I saw one again. A mirror goblin. This time I didn't look away, and this time it spoke. No matter how many times I think about it, no matter how many times I check the date, look at the pictures, or stare at the stains on the concrete, I know for a fact it was real. I died then I came back. Yesterday was perfectly normal. Maybe even a little better than normal, since I got to go out for ice cream with some friends. I woke up, ate breakfast, finished my deliveries, and then headed back home. Everything seemed fine, right up until I opened the door to my apartment and saw someone in the middle of robbing the place. I still don't know how they got in. The door was locked, the windows were barred, and I live on the 3rd floor. Yet there they were, and it quickly became a fight. Looking back, I wish I'd just called the police. But instead I lunged at them, thinking I could stop them. I didn't see the knife until it was too late. They stabbed me in the gut, and I bled out right there on the floor of my own apartment. My last thought, oddly enough, wasn't of pain or fear. It was regret. My final words, whispered to nobody in particular, were, "I hope Mom comes to my funeral." I don't know why I said it. In hindsight, it seems so insignificant, like I should have had some grand, profound thought. But at that moment, all I could think about was my mother. Then I woke up. I didn't wake up in the hospital or in some afterlife. I woke up in my own bed, wearing a completely different set of clothes, with no wound, no pain, nothing. It was like the whole thing had never happened, except for the very real, very red blood stain on the floor where I'd died just hours before. At first, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare, but the blood, the blood was real. I was the victim of a murder, and now, inexplicably, I was alive again. I didn't know what to do. I stared at the blood stain for what felt like hours, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I knew I couldn't call the police. How would I even begin to explain it? Hey, I was murdered, but don't worry, I'm fine now. Yeah, right. So I did the only thing I could think of. I threw a mat over the blood stain, took a deep breath, and tried to move on. That day felt like a dream. I went through the motions, ate breakfast, went to work, delivered packages, came home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I kept expecting someone to notice, to say something, but nobody did. The world moved on, oblivious, while I stood there, wondering if my death had meant anything at all. After work, I decided to take a detour through the park. I needed to clear my head, figure things out. I asked myself 100 questions. Why was I revived? Did the robber do something to bring me back, or was something else involved? Was this a one-time thing, or could I die again and come back? I may have been given a second chance, but I wasn't eager to see if I had a third. By the time I got home, I felt okay, not great, but better. I told myself I'd figure it out eventually, that maybe this was all some kind of strange blessing, a second shot at life. I wasn't looking for any answers that night. I just wanted to sleep. But then I saw something outside my window. It was dark, and at first I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but there was someone or something out there, staring in. I panicked, grabbed my phone, and called the police. Then I hid in my closet, trying to stay as quiet as possible. It's been hours now. I called the police twice, but they haven't shown up. The thing outside hasn't left, and I can hear it tapping on the window, like it's taunting me. I don't think it's the robber. It's too short to ... Strange. I don't know what it is, but I can't shake the feeling that it knows about me, about what happened. I'm scared to move. I'm scared to make a sound. My phone battery is at 57%, and I'm just sitting here in the closet, waiting for anything to happen. I keep typing because it's the only thing keeping me sane right now. But I don't know how much longer I can stay like this. It's been almost 3 hours. The tapping hasn't stopped. It's knocking on the window now, louder, more insistent. I don't know what to do. I want to run, but I'm too afraid. I can see its eyes in the reflection of my phone screen. They're staring right at me. It's behind me. Oh God, help me, please. I don't know what to do. I don't know what it wants. I woke up again. I'm sitting in a donut shop a box from my apartment. Somehow, I made it out. I don't remember how I got here. I just know that whatever was in my apartment killed me again. And I came back again. I tried calling the police, but the call keeps dropping. No one's phones seem to be working. I feel like I'm trapped in some kind of nightmare that I can't wake up from. I don't know what's going on, but I'm terrified that it's not over. Whatever that thing is, it's not done with me. I can die, and I will come back. But for what purpose? I don't want to find out. After arriving at the hotel, I called Mac, a coworker I trusted, telling him that I was staying here because of a stalker. It felt like the easiest excuse to make. I didn't want to burden him with the truth, at least, not yet. He asked if I had reached out to the police, and I lied, saying I had, but that they were powerless without more evidence. That seemed to satisfy him. We ended up talking about the flaws in law enforcement, about how justice often requires proof that vanishes when you need it most. His words were comforting in a strange way, even though I knew the real danger had nothing to do with the law. It's almost 11:30 p.m. now, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief. My plan seemed solid. Mac would stay for a bit, keep me company, and maybe, just maybe, the thing outside wouldn't dare approach while he was here. But as soon as he stepped into the bathroom, I saw it again. This time, it wasn't pressed against the window like it had been last night. It was down in the parking lot, standing far enough away to make out only the vague contours of its twisted form. Its eyes locked on me. I was certain of it. I didn't dare look away until Mac returned. Maybe his presence would drive it off. Or maybe it wouldn't matter at all. When he came out of the bathroom, the relief I expected didn't come, because he saw it too. I wasn't alone in my terror anymore. Mac was now a part of this nightmare. He tried calling the police, but his phone, like mine before, dropped the call as if something was cutting off our only connection to help. He got angry when I told him the full story, the things I had kept hidden, but eventually he understood. He knew he wouldn't have believed me if I'd told him sooner. Now we're here, taking shifts, watching the thing that hasn't moved in what feels like hours. It's just standing there, waiting, but there's something worse. It can reach me. Even from across the lot, I can feel its touch like cold pins and needles crawling over my skin. When it pulls away, the sensation lingers, itching, burning. I don't know how it does it, but I know that this thing is toying with me. It could kill me if it wanted to, but it chooses not to. I'm not afraid of death anymore. I know I'll come back just like before. But Mackie won't. I can't let him die because of me. I feel paralyzed. My phone is in my hand, but my fingers are numb. I can't drop it. The tingling is spreading, and I know it's the thing's doing. It's watching me, waiting for something, but I don't know what. Questions race through my mind, spilling out like a fevered conversation between me and the creature. It doesn't speak, but somehow I feel its answers, like whispers in the back of my head. Why me? Why are you bringing me back? Is this permanent? The silence that follows is deafening, and yet I understand. It wasn't random. It chose me for a reason I can't fathom. And now, as I sit here, typing with stiff hands and fading hope, I realize I've been playing into its game all along. The endless cycle of death and resurrection is what it wants. The more I die, the more power it seems to gather. It doesn't kill me outright because this is the fate it has designed for me, an existence in the shadow of death, doomed to wake up every day, alive again, only to die once more. Mac is still hiding, probably watching the thing from under the bed. I can't imagine what he sees, and I'm sorry I dragged him into this. I wish I could tell him to leave, to run far away, but I know it's too late for that now. This thing has its grip on both of us. I'm sure Mac is reading over my shoulder as I write this. If you're reading this after I die, Mac, please understand I'll be okay. I've been through this before, but you need to leave. Don't come looking for me after tonight. I don't want anyone else to die because of me. The shadows are shifting now, like static in the air. I can see its form, dark and unnatural, moving closer, even though it hasn't moved from its spot in the parking lot. It's everywhere and nowhere at once, slipping through the cracks of reality. My mind wants to believe it's just a trick of the light, a fragment of fear-induced hallucination, but I know better now. This is real as the blood that stains my apartment floor, as real as the pain that stabs through me when it decides it's time for me to die again. I ask that why it keeps doing this, why it won't just let me stay dead, or worse, why it doesn't let me live in peace. I didn't expect an answer, but I got one all the same. The answer wasn't in words, it was in the weight of the silence that followed. It wants me to break. It wants me to surrender. This is a game for it, a twisted, malevolent game, and I am its favorite toy. I am supposed to keep dying, waking, and dying again, each time losing more of myself until I am nothing but a hollow shell, filled with fear and despair. That's when it will have won. I won't give it the satisfaction. I can't. Not yet. Mac is looking at me now. His face is pale, eyes wide with terror as he peeks out from beneath the bed. I don't know what he sees from there, but it's bad enough that he doesn't want to come out. I hate that I've done this to him. I never should have asked him to come. I should have handled this on my own. Now, I don't know if he'll survive the night. I don't know if I will either, but if I die again, I know I'll wake up. I always wake up. I just wish I knew how long this will go on. The creature, it's moving now, slowly, deliberately, as if it knows that the end is near. It's been toying with me long enough. The pins and needles sensation is getting stronger, crawling up my arms, my neck. My throat tightens. I can't speak, can't scream. I glance at Mac one last time, mouthing an apology I know he won't accept. I can't feel my hands anymore. I can't breathe. The room is spinning, and everything is going dark. I'm going to die, and I'll wake up again tomorrow. I don't know how to stop it. I don't know if I ever will, but maybe, just maybe, there's still a chance. If you're reading this, if somehow this message gets through, please don't come looking for me. Let me stay lost in this nightmare. Let me wake up alone. It's the only way to keep you safe, because the thing said one last thing before the darkness swallowed me whole. They'll wake up. The end came quietly. No screams. No violent struggle, just a slow fade into nothingness. But I knew, deep down, I wasn't truly gone. I would wake again just like before, and the nightmare would continue, but this time, this time something felt different. As the darkness took me, I felt a tug, a pull, like something was trying to stop me from crossing back, like the creature was losing its grip. For a moment, just a fleeting second, I thought I might finally be freed. But then I woke up, not in the hotel, not in my apartment, but somewhere else entirely. The game isn't over yet. It was a warm Saturday morning when I decided to make my way back to Trail 4, armed with nothing more than garden shears, a few bags of mulch, and a trusty podcast to keep me company. I made the trek out to the roped-off trail. The sun was already high in the sky, and the heat was merciless, but I had a determination that outweighed my discomfort. The park was quiet, as it usually was on weekend mornings. The main trails had a few early hikers, some families with small children, and the occasional seasoned hiker who came out for the challenge of Lampfly Falls. But nobody ever wandered near Trail 4. The rope across the entrance was more symbolic than anything. It wasn't particularly high, and anyone determined enough could easily step over it. But the general attitude toward the trail was one of indifference or even avoidance. Nobody really cared what lay beyond that rope, except me. I knelt down and began cutting away at the overgrown brush, clearing the entrance bit by bit. The path that had once been so familiar to me as a child was now choked with weeds, roots, and low-hanging branches. The trail itself seemed to resist my efforts, as if nature was reclaiming it for good. But I pressed on, working my way deeper into the forest tot as I cut through the undergrowth. I thought about my parents and the memories we shared on this trail. My dad had always been the adventurous one, a military man who could handle anything thrown his way. My mom, on the other hand, had to build up to it. The second hike, when she left him in the dust, still made me laugh every time I thought about it. Those memories felt distant, but still vivid enough to drive me forward. After a few hours, I stopped to take a break. The sun had moved higher, and the air was thick with humidity. I wiped the sweat from my brow and took a long sip of water from my canteen, leaning against a tree as I caught my breath. Looking down the path I had cleared so far, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The trail was slowly coming back to life, but there was something off. It was hard to put my finger on it at first. A strange stillness had settled over the area. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, even the buzzing of insects had all but vanished. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook off the unease and got back to work, determined to finish what I had started. But as I ventured deeper into the trail, the air grew thicker, almost oppressive. The undergrowth became denser, and the path more difficult to discern. It was as if the trail didn't want to be cleared, as if it was fighting against me. About an hour later, I stumbled upon something unexpected. There, in the middle of the trail, half buried under layers of fallen leaves and dirt, was an old wooden signpost. I cleared away the debris and squinted at the faded lettering. The words were barely legible, but I could make out the name of the trail, Black Hollow. I'd never heard the name before. Confused, I stood up and looked around. The trail ahead was even more overgrown than the sections I'd already cleared, and it seemed to curve off into a part of the forest I didn't recognize. This wasn't part of the original trail I had walked with my parents. I was certain of that. But the sign was old, worn by time and weather, which meant this path had existed for a long time, long before the park had roped it off. Curiosity piqued. I decided to follow the path a little farther just to see where it led. As I moved forward, the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing taller and more twisted. The air was cooler here, almost unnaturally so, and a faint mist began to rise from the ground. I felt an odd sense of dread creeping up my spine, but I pushed it down, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, this was just a trail, an old, forgotten trail that had been overgrown for years. There was nothing to be afraid of, or so I thought. The deeper I went, the more unsettling things became. Strange markings began to appear on the tree's carvings that looked almost like symbols or runes. They were crude and weathered, but they were definitely not natural. Someone had been here before, and they had left their mark. My heart began to race as I realized how far off the beaten path I had wandered. The sensible part of my brain was screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place, and forget I had ever found it. But something else, something deeper, urged me to keep going. I had come this far, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important waiting for me at the end of this trail. After what felt like an eternity, the path finally opened up into a small clearing. At the center of the clearing was an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof caved in and its walls covered in moss and vines. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. I stood there, staring at the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with silence, the only sound the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something I couldn't quite explain, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to know. I took a step forward, my foot crunching on the leaves beneath me. Then, without warning, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending a chill down my spine. The door to the cabin creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Against my better judgment, I walked toward the cabin. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me in, something unseen and unknowable. I stepped up to the threshold and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Scattered across the floor were dozens of old, tattered photographs. They were yellowed with age, but I could still make out the faces in them. Faces of people, hikers, park rangers, families. Some of the faces I even recognized from the park's bulletin board. Photos of missing persons that had been posted over the years. But the most unsettling part, in every single photo, there was something in the background. Something tall, dark, and shadowy, standing just beyond the frame, watching Dot. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the darkness of the cabin. I decided on giving the path a real name, something memorable and important. Frigg's Fortitude. My mom is pagan, and in particular, we are firm respecters of the earth, with various imagery of Frigg in my mom's kitchen. My mom found peace in Frigg, and within Wiccan culture after some really bad experiences with my dad's Mormon side of the family, of which my dad no longer worships either. He's now semi-pagan, or at least respects it. Either way, Frigg has been a large figure for my mom, and considering she also conquered this trail once, I figure it was the perfect name. Fortitude came with the knowledge that carving this path wouldn't be easy. It would take determination. Still, I was driven by the idea of restoring something important to me and my family. The next weekends were long. My first Saturday out, I spent a good 8 hours clearing the trail. From around 10 a.m. to a little after 6 p.m. my body ached from the shoveling, the mulching, and the endless cutting away of overgrowth as I slowly carved my way through Frigg's Fortitude. By the time I went back to work the following Monday, the soreness was real, but I figure it was worth it. The next weekend, I cut back a little, deciding on 6 hours instead. Based on my tracking, I estimated I was halfway done with the trail. To celebrate, I marked my progress with a little red flag and rewarded myself with a cheeseburger from Wendy's that night. Another week passed, and I loaded up my car, ready to continue the job. But as I reached the trail entrance, I was stopped by Bee, the director's granddaughter. Bee, who practically grew up in the park, living on the second floor of the main building, asked what I was up to. I gave her the rundown on the path, and she found my dedication amusing, but warned me of heavy rains from the previous night. "Be careful out there," she said as I drove toward the trail. Sure enough, my halfway point was washed out. My hard work from the week before had been undone by Mother Nature, but I was determined, and I set about clearing the path again, shoveling the wet dirt, laying new mulch, and reflagging where I had left off. For hours in, I was beat. As I sat down to drink some water, I realized that my phone wasn't working. My podcast had stopped loading, and I couldn't get a signal, not even for emergency services. My phone usually worked great out here, better than in town, but now there was nothing. I tried all the usual tricks, lifting my phone into the air, walking a bit to reset the signal, but still nothing. Annoyed, I put my phone away and continued working. By the time I reached my last point, I planted a blue flag since I had run out of red ones, packed up, and headed to Starbucks for a little post-work treat. The next Saturday, I set off once again. But when I got to the blue flag marker, something felt off. The placement was wrong. I double-checked my progress with my distance markers and the GPS map on my phone, but everything was off. Not just the blue flag, all the flags were out of place. The red flags from earlier weeks were still there, but they had shifted, leading off into completely different directions. It was as if someone had deliberately moved them and taken my blue flag altogether. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just overworked and seeing things, or maybe someone was pulling a prank. Either way, I was determined to finish what I started. I spent another long day clearing the path, reflagging, and laying fresh mulch, determined to push through the confusion. By the time I finished, I planted a green flag at my new halfway point and made my way to the car. Exhausted, I packed everything in and started to leave. But just as I was about to get into my car, a cool breeze from the path brushed against my skin, sending a chill up my spine. I froze, my eyes locked onto the trail. There was nothing unusual that I could see, but something about the moment felt off, like the path was watching me, pulling me in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I could stand there staring at the trail forever. "Are you okay?" I jumped, clutching my chest as my heart nearly burst out of my throat. It was B. "Shit, B. Don't sneak up on me like that," I gasped, trying to calm down. "What did you say?" "I was just saying goodbye," she smiled. "I wanted to check how the trail was coming along. Looks like you've had a long day, huh?" I laughed, explaining how tough it had been. But then I asked, "Hey, has anyone else been down trail for besides me? Someone's been messing with the flags, and my blue flag was missing." B shook her head. "Nope, no one else has gone down there. That trail isn't worth the trouble, even if you were paid." I glanced back toward the trail. The shadows were starting to grow long as night crept in. "Cool," I muttered. "Can you ask the night watch to keep an eye on things? It's already hard enough without having to redo all my work." B nodded, understanding my frustration. I made my way home, took Sunday off, and rested, feeling accomplished but still uneasy about the flags. Then the next week rolled around. I arrived early, ready to finish what I started. But when I reached the trail, I couldn't believe my eyes. The entire path had changed. Not just minor shifts or new growths, everything was different. The direction of the trail, the arcs I had carefully mapped, even the landmarks were wrong. I stood there, staring at the twisted, unfamiliar path, trying to make sense of it all. It was impossible. I had documented every step of the trail. I knew for a fact it was correct, and yet it was as if the earth itself had rearranged everything overnight.